So might as well begin. I wanted to say that we'll meet obviously next week, and as I assigned last week, by next week you should have read pages 89 through 110 in the Steinbaugh edition. This would be sections 18b through 24 in Being in Time. And today we'll try our best to get through as much as we can of sections 14 through 18, which is 63 through 88. And this is, So today we would hopefully end, or at least get up to Descartes' interpretation of the world, page 87. And then, next week, the crucial sections will be Dasein and space, sections 22 through 24. Now, let me see if I brought it with me. I think I put it in another pile. Let me just see. It might be in my notes still. Oh yeah. So I wanted to say another way of reading this for our purposes is maybe to look now, it's in the handout I gave you, we're in the general understanding of the understanding of being. We're in generalities. One, maybe getting a little more specific. Section 2, we've gone pretty much through the idea of fundamental ontology, foundational ontology, the priority of the question, how to question, the transcendental phenomenological method, the hermeneutical method. Again, these are open-ended processes of method. It's not like you can really fix Heidegger at one methodological point, but this is the general thing. The transcendental phenomenological is about descriptions of everyday life. It's a structuralist or a pre-structuralist, pre-ontological understanding. He's using this method of reduction, and a destruction of the history of ontology alongside of, construction in terms of building towards this Dasein as the exemplary being, right? And then, of course, we talked about the transcendentalism in terms of the double step, etc. And now the general understanding of the understanding of being, we started with being in the world last time, and the in is very, very important. We're going to speak of that in the beginning. Again, I want us to keep in mind that we're working on a threefold thematic, if you will, generalized thematic. This is a philosophy of subjectivity, maybe of the subject. Heidegger is still prone to this kind of philosophy of subjectivity in the early work. It's also a philosophy of the retrieve, and the retrieve is happening through the retrieve of the question of being, the Wiederholung that I mentioned, as retrieval, recapitulation, and repetition, the threefold notion of Wiederholung. This is a retrieve through Dasein, through our existence, if you will. We are the interrogators, rendering ourselves transparent. And then, of course, which you contributed to, I thought, in a very productive way through the mathematical, the aporia, in Being in Time. We have gone through that as well in terms of the aporia, and the impasse that is being faced at this question. So again, the reposing of the question of being, to put it in another language, the destruction of the history of ontology, right? Because he wants to do a different kind of ontology. And without Kant, it's impossible to begin this destruction of the history of ontology, because Kant is the one who loosens up the subject post-rationalism and empiricism. And then we're constructing now, we're in the moment of constructing the analytic of a Dasein, right? How this is achieved, right? And of course, asking the question, are we really going to provide a new foundation in a sense? And I don't know if that's really Heidegger's interpretation. Ultimately, I still think he wants to stick with fundamental ontology instead of the foundational at this point. I think he, again, and this is a question we can always pose to the disciplines, always, or to knowledge in general, the movement of knowledge, is there always this attempt to break foundations, right? That there's no such thing, really, ultimately, in our epoch, given advances in mathematics, undecidability, infinitude, these questions that still kind of remain open-ended, right? The Althusserian notion of aleatory materialism, which is the Marxist notion of contingency and risk, kind of, in my opinion, a re-articulation of what Adorno's really talking about. Althusser and Adorno kind of walk, in similar paths, maybe different sides of the Maginot line, but they're certainly walking in similar paths here. So this whole notion of contingency and risk and chance, right, in the modern age. So the shaking of the foundation, the breaking of the foundations, Adorno's fractured dialectic, if you will, Heidegger's broken hammer. This is what he talks about. We do not know the hammer unless it's broken, right? And this is another thing. We have to know use first. And I'm going to talk about that today with the Vorhanden and the Zoomhanden elements, right? So that'll be, so we'll go there. I want to just give you some of the sections just for your reading. This is a reading strategy once again. So we had, we basically did 1 through 8 and really 1 through 14 very carefully. But the second part, the movement, really we're talking about 12, 13, and 28 for being in the world, right? 12, 13 are really concerned with being in the world, and section 28. And the reason I mentioned section 28 is that in 28, you begin to see design, right, is the task of the thematic analysis of being in. So if you want to go ahead and read in advance, this is a good time to do so. 130, the Existential Constitution of the there. That's section 20. What does it mean, the there, or the, and some people translate da as here. So we have to kind of be careful. Some people, some people from the 60s know there was a movement, Be Here Now, right? Ram Baba Das, right? And, this was taken up as, Heideggerian.
There was a film called Being There.
Being There was Kosinski, right? Kosinski.
Was that a takeoff on
Yes,
Heidegger?
it was. It was Chancey the gardener, who only let nature be, right? It was a parody in some ways. Yeah. Being There. Yes, of course. Yeah. So 28. So 12, 13, and 28 for being in. 12, of course, being the sketch of being in the world in terms of the orientation of being in as such, and 2, the exemplification of being in a founding mode, meaning in a knowledge mode, right? Where do we get the knowledge at that point? Then we would go on, and if you go back to your chart, I'm trying to do this as well as we can with a mapping. I think this is very important for the first, second, and third encounters, at least with being to kind of map it out. So we have attunement, understanding, and speech. And this is going to be in sections 29, 30, and 31 in particular, 31 and 34. So 31 is understanding, and 34 is discourse, language. And I'm going to spend some time on that because I think this section, especially section 34, is very, very important for, everything from existential psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, linguistic theory, all of these aspects. Heidegger gives some elements to really work with, and so we can see, the level of the thought process here, and how it's, tremendously influential on all the disciplines, right? And including Foucault, with the discourse and discursive regularities and all of this. This is a section that Foucault read very, very carefully. Yeah, very carefully. I think Foucault read very carefully the sections on Dasein and being in the world, the sections on the language and the hermeneutical situation, which is in chapter 3. So anyway, that going on, and then thrownness and projection, which is section 29. So I'm just giving you, some sections to work with as we go into the second phase. And then, of course, the being of design, the foundation, which is care, Zorga, we mentioned this already. You'll see 41, 42 on care, right? And 41 and 42 give you both the heuristic function, the wholeness, and speaking of dialectics earlier, part and whole are certainly working here, but it's a very different approach than the way Adorno will engage it. But I think there is some complementarity here. I am more of the school at this point that we should look at convergences, and divergences, and there's a lot converging between the master materialist dialectician Adorno and the hermeneutic, Heidegger, right? I think there's a lot to be said for certain convergences. I'm not trying to meld them. I'm really not trying to, but at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of convergence in terms of the thought. Okay, and then we'll go on. Yes, like I said, the being of design is care, section 41. This is in chapter 6, care as the being of design. This is, in a way, the crux, if you will, of the book, right? This is section, chapter 6, sections 41 and 42. And this is where you see wholeness, and you have this in your outline, self and being in, and self and being with, right? So you're being in a world and being with Mitsein and the being in a world are both very important. What Heidegger was criticized for initially was that he did not flesh out the being with. That it stayed at a philosophy of subjectivity only. And this is where Sartre's being in nothingness, 1943, 16 years later, comes in. He writes a very long section in Being in Nothingness called Concrete Relations with Others. Right? And, this is his attempt to flesh out what Heidegger left undone. Yeah, so this will give you an indication. Then we'll go up to care. And like I said, you have the other stuff, the totality. We'll talk about the totality, the heuristic function of death, care, the ecstasies, and of course ecstatic temporality as the precondition for history. Okay? You need the ecstasies, the three ecstasies, the forms, the past, present, and future, in a kind of vaulting forward, if you will. And, we can kind of maybe thematize that around the poetry of the future. I had a discussion with Stanley yesterday about a Heideggerian Marxism and Kostas Axelos, and my position is that poiesis is more than necessary in the Marxist tradition today. Too much dominance on the economic categories, etc., and that what we've forgotten is his great saying about the poetry of the future. So we're going to look at this in terms of ecstasies as a kind of poetry of the future, and at the same time, and poetry means creativity as well, and also think of this as a condition for history. What would this mean as we try to think this in terms of other wise thinking or alternative modes of thinking or areas of thinking. So that's where we'll go with temporality, and then we'll do the modifications, and we'll talk actively about, we'll hint at it now, but we'll talk more substantially about authenticity, or what is proper to my own, and inauthenticity, and avoidance, fallenness, the avoidance of dread, anxiety, these kind of things, and kind of end up there. And then we'll look at what knowledge and practice can we get out of this. I'd like to make a link to Foucault on that final, that final thing. And then, of course, the roles of Heidegger today that I didn't put on the general outline. So anyway, okay, so that's where we're going. So for the next, to keep it very specific for the next couple of weeks, next week we'll do the chapter 3 of Division 1. We'll finish it up, pages 89 to 110. Right, and then following that, we'll start looking at.
Wait, did you say no class next week?
No, there is class.
Okay.
No, I'm coming back from Montreal just to have
Okay.
class. I'll come back Friday. Yeah, I'm going up for 2 days. Yeah, so I'll be back. Yes, yeah. No, we're gonna have class here next week, And then I have LIU. If Stanley teaches here and it continues on the 9th, we'll meet here. But if not, I have LIU already ready, and I have the 16th at LIU, and I doubt he's going to do the 16th.
No
So,
update on the homepage
yeah,
of the
yeah,
website.
I know, but I have the room. Yep.
Radical
Yeah,
Imagination
yeah,
Institute will,
yeah,
will
right.
have the, okay, that's
perfect.
and there's a
Sorry.
calendar page as well, so we'll have the addresses.
Okay, perfect.
Right, right.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, and then we're also gonna, January, I'm thinking middle of January, at least 2 Saturdays to begin with in January. You know, and then we can go from there. We'll see how we're doing, you know. I mean, I would like to complete,
In,
yeah,
in
yeah,
a
yeah.
certain way, I don't know, just speaking like personally,
Yes.
this almost seems like it necessitates a spring continuation. If you want. if
We
you
want to
think-
spring forth,
if-
huh?
if
We're gonna
just-
do another sprung.
It's a really
Okay,
yeah.
we'll spring forth, okay. Yeah, no, I have no problem doing it. I mean, you know, for me, this is a real pleasure to go back to it and rethink it and see what can be done with it today. So, yeah, I mean, I have no problem doing that to continue, that we really get a good grounding. And again, like I said, it's not perfect, and, you know, there are a lot of critical moments, and I do plan to talk about the left critiques of this, you know, at some time, but I don't want us to be clouded. I'm not trying to, I don't want to impose upon, you know, this right now, some of the left critiques, you know. I mean, but I can point out books and, you know, stuff. I mean, I've been on both, you know. The right critiques are not really there, you know. They're either so stupid, you know, I mean, you know, in some ways, or, you know, they're you know, so much hagiography in a way, yeah. But not American right, in a sense, you know, you get some of this, yeah. Yeah. I mean, we don't want to read the American right. I mean, I'm sure that a person like this would be found in the Steve Bannon, Richard Spencer library. Whether they read one line of it is another story. Whether they comprehended anything of it, that is even a greater story. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. And this is, you know, part of our problem in the United States. That, you know, we get characters like this who can get away with this kind of stuff in high positions, such as, yeah. You know, I mean, you know, can you imagine Lenin supporting Roy Moore? And Steve Bannon calls himself a Leninist. Right?
What?
You think about this. Well, he does. No. Yeah. Yeah. Many ways. Yeah. And I will talk about the fourth wave thinking in the Soviet. Maybe Arto can, you know, expound on this when we get there too. When we talk about, you know, the use of Heidegger in the new Russia. Right? The new Russia. We'll talk about fourth wave theory and how this is influencing Putin and others. So we can talk about that. And, you know, yeah. And I mean, I'm very upset with David Cronenberg. I don't know personally. But anyway, he should make the sequel to Eastern Promises. It's time. It was a great film. I don't know. Have you seen Eastern Promises? Beautiful film, huh? Yeah. Yeah. There was supposed to be a sequel that would continue the story
Really?
with a new generation with Vincent Gazelle, you know, as the new leader, you know, with Viggo Morgenstern has completely infiltrated the Russian mob in the oligarchs in London, right? Yeah, yeah. So anyway, but that's another story. Yeah, but we'll talk about Eastern Promises as a kind of generic, metaphoric to look at.
Well, Viggo Mortensen.
I don't blame you. Brief History of Violence. History of Violence, huh? Not brief. It was a history of violence. Great film. You liked him as Freud?
What?
As Freud? He
Yeah.
played Sigmund Freud in the film.
No, I didn't see that.
Oh, yeah.
I saw him in Eastern Promises, especially the bath scene.
Oh boy, Chris, yeah. See, I'm exonerated now, folks. Yeah. That's great, yeah. It's quite a scene. If you haven't seen Eastern Promises, it's one of the great films of the last, 15, 20 years. I mean, it's very much up there. Very beautifully constructed. The plot is very interesting, and yeah. And he's a superb actor. I think he and Daniel Day-Lewis, in my opinion, that generation are far beyond everybody else in terms of, their ability to method act and, get inside the character. Yeah. He's great in The History of Violence. That's another great film.
I saw that, yeah.
Great film. Yeah. So, okay. So So why don't we go to, today we're going to do being in and world. And so why don't I begin with the, and just for people that weren't here, last week we talked a little bit about types of inquiry here on the, under Gestalt. The cogito was the Descartes, and I put up the times of the method. And there, I guess I'm trying to rethink why there's so many reference points here. But I think the technepoian was the distinction between the craft of making and the craft of creativity, you know, together, the poetic versus the technical, or the craft making, and that tension that goes on. It's not really an opposition. The design analysis, of course, was the therapeutic, you know, interpretation of Heideggerian, you know, ontology. It became used by Ludwig Binswanger, Henri Ellenberger, and others. And so anyway, going to the existential analytic, where we really are right now. We're in the beginnings of the existential analytic. And another thing about analytic, you know, the Greek word for analysis really means to loosen up, to free up. So when we use the term analysis, you know, it's really the freeing up of the existential and the existential characteristic. It's not just sitting over and I'm analyzing A, B, and C or something like that. It's really freeing up a horizon, if you will, you know, in a way. Okay, so then there was an object of inquiry, between the ontological and the ontic, right? So you have a type of inquiry which is ontological, which we have been dealing with in the beginning of the first 8 sections of the of being in time, versus the entities, the sein as, right, with the beings, lowercase, the ontic, right? But it is only through the ontic that we're going to be able to get back to the ontological, but the ontological is always presupposed, right? Okay, always is there. The terms of the inquiry, the existentials, in terms of the ontology, the ontic, with being, versus that of categories, you know, for the ontic. So when we talked about that last time too, that you have the categories, you know, are kind of secondary, if you will, right? When you begin to build a table of categories or a use of kind of categories, right? The factical versus that of the factual. This was another thing between the ontological and the existential versus the existentials, which are traits in the ontic instead of the existential, the outstandingness, if you will, of being, you know, in the ontological register. So, anyway, let me see if I can get this back in here. So, anyway, so this is good to keep in mind, you know, when you're beginning any kind of inquiry, right, any investigation. You know, for Heidegger, the investigation is always on 2 registers, the ontological and the ontic, right? And that they have different, you know, the sein, the ontological, the existentials, the factical, facticity of every, you know, the existential versus the existentials, the characteristics, and you should have this in some of the outline I gave you. The factical, the categorization versus that of the existentials. So this is very interesting in Sartre's sense. I think Sartre really understood this very well and articulated, at least to my mind, when he said existence precedes essence, which is a very radical thought, because you cannot be essentialized. You know, you're not, quote, Greek American, African American, Japanese American, you know, Jamaican American, whatever. Anyway, only Jamaican. Sorry, working on. Yeah, I don't know if you really want it, you know, but anyway. but anyway, all these kind of bureaucratizations, right, and identity politics is very much based on this kind of categorical thinking, and it is a way of kind of undoing, right, this fixity and this dogma of, you know, how one considers oneself, right? How one sees oneself and how the outside sees you. So in a way, the existence preceding the essence is quite an advance over, you know, this essentializing tendency. So you can see it at work in Heidegger here too. That a priori we are existentialists, right? Existentials, right? Not existentials. We're not characteristics, traits, you know, the biological, you know, the race, ethnicity, all these kind of things are not so much important. And you know, remember we did talk about he's very much against the biological racism, you know, which is another thing he does not have in common with National Socialism or with the Nazis. And this is a very important thing to keep in mind. He did not have any kind of belief in biological racism, or this was a very, you know, very a concept to him or a category that was completely anathema to this way of thinking. You know, so this is very important to remember. Yeah, in this regard. Yeah.
On the other side of that chart.
You mean here?
Yeah, I can't.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure. Let me just do this before. Yeah. So yeah. So these are the entities, which we are. This is us. Here. Right? On to categories. We're the design investigators, right? Here. But this is already there. Right?
Is that
always
what we are,
already?
or is that what we do?
What's that?
Is that what we are, or is that what we do? Because we aren't.
Well, the is here. You're right,
Right,
in a
right,
sense.
yeah.
But this is where we are. Yes.
Well,
this is
we
our
do.
design, right? In some ways. Yeah. But go ahead. Yeah.
I thought design was on the other side.
No, Dasein is here and here, right? Both,
Right.
And Sein, capitalized, is here. Yeah, I don't want us to get, you know, totally fixed on the correspondence of the charts, but think of this as movement, because we are the interrogators. It's through our analytic, the existential analytic, that we are going to begin to question, again, to bring up the question of being. We've forgotten it. So we're forgetful, you know, folks, here, right? But we're raising anew that question. We have a vagueness, we have trivialized the question of being, etc. But it is only through this and a destruction of the categories and a reconstruct, you know, of ontology, through, you know, getting beyond positivism and the facts in the case, right? That we're able to begin to kind of think relationally ontic to ontological. Okay? So we are here. This is the, if you will, for lack of a better term, the social.
Right.
Okay? And for lack of a better term.
Right.
Yeah.
And ontology.
So we're lowercase beings.
Right.
Right?
This is
But
why he took
we're-
up this
yeah.
argument.
I'm
This is
sorry?
why he took up this argument. This is why he's doing what he's doing. Because we
Yes.
are mistakenly over here when we.
Yes,
Right.
the great mistake in
Right.
the history of Western metaphysics, right, is it has led us to this.
Right. Exactly.
This is where we are. This is where we've been led to. You know, so we've been led astray.
I just wasn't clear when you said what
Yeah.
we are.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Not for reading.
Yeah.
I'm
I
like-
mean, look,
I mean, in
you
terms
could
of
substitute for
Being
yeah,
versus ontological versus ontical, right? We aren't
right.
the ontical. This is where we think
Right.
we are. Right.
Ontological is
We
like
have
Heidegger.
become this
We have
because
become
of the
this.
destiny
But we're
of
really-
In philosophy,
Western.
we're
Yeah.
going to become
Right.
ontological.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
We're trying to become ontological
Right.
again. We're trying to raise the question first. So the first step is always the questioning, learning how to question, one of the reasons, right? But the primary underneath both this right here, and we'll see this later, is care. Because if you remember, I built, you know, for lack of a better way of doing it, a triadic, you know, a moment of self, world, and care, right? And this is what we're really trying to investigate here, right? And care is one of the foundational, world is another one, as we'll learn today. And of course, self or subject, or if you want to say, and I have no problem doing that, just design, orientation. We are oriented on the earth, right? On planet Earth. We dwell, we reside.
Design that can't be extricated from the dot.
No,
That's why it's so.
no.
But there's design and there's design that.
Well, look, yeah, but look.
As Dasein, we're designed to have a da always within our being.
Yeah, I mean, Dasein, once again, is the exemplary figure in the retrieve. You cannot have the retrieve just coming from the voice of being. right? It has to go through.
Because this design is made up of multiple beings.
It can be made up of multiple beings,
Well,
but you're
right.
also,
As
yes.
you read through here, it
Right,
keeps
right.
articulating
There's a
a bunch of-
multiplicity of,
right.
yes, that's
You
going
should say
on.
beings instead of being.
Right,
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
to be clear.
But we are the exemplar, once again, we as Dasein are the exemplar of the retrieve of the question of being and its meaning. And only we, right, Dasein, can give the meaning, right? However, that meaning has been also hidden and forgotten, right? And is layered and layered and layered. And in his sense, it's through material etymology that we might be able to get back to this. And hence, in terms of his own project, and this is where the nationalism comes in, or in terms of a kind of dominant language, it is only through the German philosophical language in relation to the Greek language of the pre-Socratic and maybe at the beginning of the systematic philosophical era that this dialogue or this logic moment can happen. This is where the dialogue really happens, the dialogism. Not the dialectic, the dialogism, where there's an actual hearing. Right? So yeah. So again, the privileging here, we not only have forgotten the question, of being, right? And the meaning of being, we've forgotten how to hear. Right? Yeah. We've forgotten how to hear. And we will see this in world today in terms of metaphors of sight. He goes through many levels of sight, circumspection. He's going to play on the German language, and I'll try to give you some of this. My German is really not good, but anyway, I know some of the philosophical language, and he's also playing. Again, you read this in German. I've attempted it out loud a little bit, but you begin to see the playfulness and the repetition. There's a musicality to it. It's not like you're only reading Teutonic Overload. In some ways, right? Yeah. So there is something to be said for the problem of translation in a lot of ways, that's happening here. So, yeah. But remember what these people gave us in the 20th century. I mean, every advance in almost every discipline came out of the German mind, German science. So, this is, something to think about. Is this mind the modern Greek? This is Heidegger's thinking. There's a, Derrida calls it a nostalgia, Heideggerian hope, right? Other people have called it another kind of nostalgia, right? Luddites, this kind of thing against technology. I think they're completely wrong about that. But anyway, but there are elements there. Again, the privileging is really that of this interiorized dialogue. Your anamnesis, not your hyponemata, but your remembering, your recollection, your active recollection, is in dialogue with the ancient Greek. Mm-hmm. This is where we went wrong. We went wrong because of an error in Plato and Aristotle. So at one level, this is also a long dialogue with Aristotelian metaphysics and the question of being. And the difference between ontology and metaphysics that we talked about earlier, in this investigation. So I mean, it's a lot to keep in mind, retain, but at the same time, I mean, I think it's helpful because you begin to see, if you can look at this in terms of overarching, questions, right? As well as when he gets into the specifics, right? What are the terms? See, these are terms of inquiry. The existentials versus the categories. So if you begin your investigation with existence precedes essence, instead of I've got a category for this, right? Yeah. So you can think about the subversiveness of this. So, Peter and I and some other people, and I think we talked about this a little bit, we were thinking of, getting a middle school, right? A charter left middle school, right? Now, of course, the thing to keep getting the money for these things, you have to show very good results on the Regents tests. So think about a school where you would take, categorical thinking, teach the kids both this, but at the same time you were also working in the register of real education outside the categories and having them understand this and what presuppositions are involved. think about an educational program that would have that in mind, you know, that could really just decode texts. I mean, tests, I'm sorry, and texts, of course, but yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, this is very subversive in that sense, right? Like Adorno in his way certainly has that too. And I mean subversive in the sense of undoing the damage, because in a way, education is really about undoing the damage that's been done, you know, in my mind. It's unlearning. That's what we're in the process of. This is what Heidegger, if I could put it in one phrase of right opening chapter, it would be, you know, processes of unlearning. Right? We don't learn. We have to unlearn. Right? And this is what he's really, I think, really up to here. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'll wait for Chris to come back and go to the section. So that's what we did sort of last week, and then I had the movement of the stepping back, the transcendental, the stepping back to the trace things. This is the transcendental phenomenological method, and then the standing or the stepping beyond. You know, we talked a little bit about this with leap of faith today in Kierkegaard, but this is more, you know, you're really stepping beyond the phenomena, and this is going on in the level we didn't really. I think deepen this today enough, the principle of reflection in dialectical thinking in Hegel. You know, this is where this is coming from. This is more coming out of Kant to Heidegger and being in time, but it's certainly in Hegel where the reflective activity is both a trace backward to the originative or to the emergent or the springing forth of the phenomena, and also a stepping beyond, which is the transcendent, right? That you're moving both back and forth, right? And in a way, a kind of good reading strategy, you know, prospective and retrospective, right? You're always in that kind of dual movement, you know, that's happening, you know, and kind of interesting. And if you read, I think you'll gain a lot from being in time if you think of reading this way as both prospective and retrospective, and that kind of activity is a real praxis. So anyway, we talked about this, the formal, that there's no everyday life ego in the formal, and you know, this maybe could have been mentioned today, the world as a transcendent subject, and the common, which is non-thematic and vague, and this is happening in everyday averageness. We did this last week too. So everyday averageness is what we're thrown into. I mean, I like Marx's great term that he used for Louis Napoleon III, for the Louis the Small, for Napoleon le Petit, a grotesque mediocrity. And this is where we're everyday average, everyday nice. And that's what I love that phrase of Marx, the grotesque mediocrity. But that grotesque mediocrity, like Trump, was able to mobilize the rabble, the homeless. All of these people were mobilized by Napoleon III, by the nephew, you know, the lesser nephew, the grotesque mediocrity. So it goes to show you what's playing out in terms of mob democracy, if you want a term of what kind of democracy we live under. Yeah, in a lot of
And
ways.
maybe the limits of the proletariat itself.
Yes, that could be.
I don't like saying that because
No, it's okay.
it goes
I mean, you can say that. Say when Peter's here. We'll talk more about that.
Yeah.
Right. So then, and then the third was the properly phenomenological, that you wrest, you know, something from the phenomena, from the Dasein. You're wresting it. It's a process of really activity of resting, you know. So from Das Man to the Dasein, right? Das Man is the everyday averageness, right? So, yeah. All right, so I was just reviewing a little bit of last week's average everydayness and you know, et cetera. So that's, yeah, essentially, you know, I mean, not essentially, but at least, you know, a good portion of what we did last week in terms of the beginning of the existential analytic. Okay, let's go to 12 and see if we can get up to 18 or at least close to it today. So the first thing, the first a priori existentially is being in a world, right? Being in a world. This is section 12 of the text. And the in is crucial. And I just read you a couple of passages here. The light's terrible, huh? Yeah, anyway.
I think you get more light up, sure.
Where would we get light from?
That's a great involved. What a great philosophical question. Where indeed.
There's a. Oh, that's
We think that's.
It's okay, Chris. I can see. I just.
Sometimes
yeah.
There we go. From a switch, we got it. Okay, very good. Thank you, Thomas Edison, or those that capitalized on, or decapitalized on it.
I wonder if they
Right.
paid the Tesla family fees
Right,
to use that
right.
name.
Okay. So, if you look at the third paragraph on page 53, section 12, for those of you that don't have the Stambaugh, the compound expression, being in the world, indicates in the very way we have coined it that it stands for a unified phenomena. Unified phenomena. This primary datum must be seen as a whole. So we begin to have being in the world as a structured whole, as a totality. But while being in the world cannot be broken up into components that may be pieced together, this, and this is what you were saying, does not prevent it from having a multiplicity of constitutive structural factors. The phenomenal fact indicated by this expression gives us a threefold perspective. If we pursue it while keeping the whole phenomenon in mind from the outset, we have the following. Okay, number one, important, the following. In the world, in relation to this factor, we have the task of questioning the ontological structure of world and of defining the idea of worldliness as such, and compare later chapter 3 of the division. The being, sein des, which is always has been in the world, is the way it is. You're always being in a world. The in is crucial again. In it, we are looking for what we are questioning when we ask about the who. In our phenomenological demonstration, we should be able to determine who is in the mode of the average everydayness of Dasein. And he wants you to compare chapter 4 of this division. Being in as such. So we have, questioning the ontological structure of world. We also having being in the world as it is, as the way it is, right? And then we have being in as such, right? The ontological constitution, this is interesting, of inness itself is to be analyzed. And this is crucial. What does it mean to be in a world? What does it mean to be in a world? Any analysis of one of these constitutive factors involves the analysis of the other. That is, each time seeing the whole phenomena. It is true that being in the world, this is important again, is an a priori, I mentioned this in the beginning, a priori necessary constitution of Dasein, but is not at all sufficient to fully determine Dasein's being. Before we thematically analyze the three phenomena indicated individually, we shall attempt to orient ourselves towards a characteristic of the third of these constituent factors. So he's going to begin a long description of what it means to be in. Right? What does being in mean? We supplement the expression being in right away with in the world, and are inclined to understand this being in as being in, sein in. With this term, the kind of being of a being is named which is in something else. As water is in the glass, the dress is in the closet. By this in, we mean the relation of being that two beings extended in space have to each other with regard to their location in that space. Water, glass, dress, and closet are both in space at a location in the same way. This relation of being can be expanded. That is, the bench in the lecture hall in the university in the city, and so on, the bench in the cosmos, in the Weltraum, right? World space, what he's using there. These beings, whose being in one another can be determined in this way, all have the same kind of being, that of being present as things occurring within the world. Being present in something objectively present, and being present together with something having the same kind of being, in the sense of a determinate relation to place, are ontologically characteristics which we call, going back to the diagram, which we call categorical. Okay? This is not an existential, right? This is not the ontological. This is the ontic at work. Okay? This is science for Heidegger as well. His way of thought, because he give you his very science does not think. Period.
Right.
We must interrogate the being of the consciousness of science. This is what's sort of going on here at one level, right? And categorical thinking. You have a comment about it? I mean, it's
No,
okay.
no,
I mean, I have no problem with
I'm
it.
waiting for us to jump to, because I just started reading the assignment because I got your email last night.
Yeah, yeah.
And I feel like when he's in chapter 14, talking about being in the world, and he's talking about the world, he may have forgotten something. He may have left something out.
Such as?
Of the world. Being of the world.
Yeah.
Meaning
For
the world is ontologically prior to being.
for
Or
Heidegger. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Possibly being is secondary. The world is, and then being comes out of. So instead of them, world and being the same ontological level, being created at the same time, one is produced from the other.
The of as in front.
Right.
Yeah. For Heidegger, the
But-
doesn't
because
make
he
it
listed,
because,
like-
again, it's a topology and it's not a consciousness.
Right, but it would have been interesting to see if he'd have listed that as well as he went through his arguments to see whether or not which one of them actually held true as he went through.
As
Rather
we
than-
like to say about the university, we're in the university, but we're not of it. This is what, certain people like to say
I
about the
get
university.
that,
Yeah,
but we're talking
yeah.
about being.
Yeah, no, I
We're talking about
understand.
something really different.
I understand, yeah.
Right, so,
But I mean, he is going to avoid such terms such as of, right? A preposition such as of, because for him that goes back to consciousness, and consciousness is not part of the topology here. He's about place, space, orientation, and how that
is.
location. No, I understand.
Right.
But you're not being conscious of it, in a sense.
Right.
You're articulating this through language. It's not just the yeah, go ahead,
I see.
I'm listening.
I see
And then
what
he'll
you're
go
doing.
through.
It seems
yeah.
like to me, the world is of Dasein.
right, he's doing it the other,
Yeah.
that way around,
Yeah.
but it would have been interesting to also have argued whether or not it was the other way around, and
Right.
if it was the other way around, what is Dasein not that the world is, or is Dasein and the world exactly the same?
No, they're not.
But it would have been interesting to.
Yeah, I
you know,
see.
he was saying-
No,
but he
because
didn't-
that would lead to a subjectivism that he wants to stay away completely from. He wants to stay away from that
He
kind of
mentions that in different
subjectivism.
uses of the word
Yeah,
world in the
yeah,
first text
yeah.
and 14.
Yeah,
And
no,
world
but
is
he
feminine,
missed-
by the way, in
Oh,
German.
so
Like,
that's the reason why I brought it up.
it's not
I
le
was just going
monde.
through that, I was
It's
like,
die
why
Welt.
did he also do,
Yeah.
because that also is,
Why wasn't that one of the mentioned
right,
uses of the
because I'm
word
like,
world?
yeah, wait, if we're gonna be doing this, why are we going just one direction? I would like to see what came out from the other direction.
Yeah.
Right? If possible, we could do that. Maybe we can't. It would have been interesting to see.
When you say the word topology,
Yeah.
Is that a Heidegger's
Right?
word,
Because he
or is it
basically,
I'm using the word as a
Decided what?
topology
The
of,
direction.
yeah,
undetermined
yeah.
space that has
Include-
no
Yeah,
He's
it
going
does
from-
on,
he's
yeah,
going
yeah.
from,
Yeah, yeah, he's
he's
against
thinking,
space.
he's
I mean, he'll think space, but for him,
He's not
place,
philology,
space,
the word.
space is.
He's not analyzing philosophy, he's not studying, he's doing it, right? That's what you said.
yeah.
He's what? He's
He's doing
doing
philosophy.
philosophy. He's not analyzing philosophy. No.
Although he's-
And again, there's not really I wouldn't say it's a hostility towards science, but he sees science as limited as objectively, and you can see this in the section
So
on
scientists would have
world.
done that.
On
That's
world.
what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But he would see, if you read the section on world, he takes up these categories that I gave you in the diagram, Zoomhanden and Vorhanden, right? And one is about objectively present versus use. And he wants to always go with use. So he sees both at work, but science only deals with the present in hand in some ways at the expense of the other. So he has this very long dialogue, if you will, with science that runs through this. Also with the philosophy of consciousness. This is not the unity of consciousness, but the unity of phenomena, right, for him. You see? So he's not trying to get there. He's trying to stay away from, quote, transcendental, consciousness, the transcendental ego, the Kantian transcendental. He's trying to stay away from these things, as well as, as I put up here, the categorical thinking.
Right.
Right.
So would you say
yeah.
he's not doing philosophy?
He is doing.
He is doing
He's
philosophy.
not doing science.
It's a verb.
He's not doing
He's not doing
science.
Yeah,
science,
it just doesn't
or he's
do
not
that.
doing both together. He doesn't distinguish science and science and ideology. He's not distinguishing that.
Yeah,
He doesn't use that kind of language like Althusser uses. But
Right.
yeah,
It would have been interesting to find out what he discovered.
yes,
Going down that road.
yes. Well, that's where he wants to go, because again, you're looking again at unlearning and unfolding. This is what Heidegger is ultimately about. He's not about ultimately giving you a new answer. He's giving you the unconcealment of what, so to speak, the scientific rational project is about, what calculative reason is about, what these are the narratives that are being not only deconstructed, but they're also the product of a long history of philosophical thinking and practice, which he can historicize, because he can't ask this question if it's not for Kant. Kant's the one who restores ontology in the Tito on. See, his major question in Greek, I hate to do it, but anyway, I'll do it, right? The major question here, once again, and this is only possible after Kant, is to ask the question of Tito on. What is being, right? Or what is it in some way? So you'll have these double movements, right, going on. This is still universal and empty, right? This is the one that's in process always.
Becoming.
Right? Yeah, becoming. Yeah. If you want to look at, yeah. Right. So it's only after Kant that he's able to ask this, because Kant renews somewhat of the question of ontology, right? Through, the building of a new table of categories, in a new system of thinking, what's called the Copernican turn in thinking, right? In which rationalism, the period of scientific reasoning, right, is now opened up, right, to undoing and critique, as well as is the empirical in terms of how we're taking evidence from the world. So these things are being put to task, so allows him to go back, to this question, which he traces, not to the 18th century, the period of the Enlightenment, but he traces this back to the Greeks. Then Aristotle asks this question, right, in the Metaphysics. So and then the question in Aristotle's Metaphysics is, what is the being of beings, right? Yeah, this is really the question of the metaphysical. Heidegger wants to say that this, in a way, set up, just principles of metaphysics, instead of really undoing and answering the question, right? So that we must go back to a more fundamental, ontology against that of the metaphysical question of what are the first principles, the metaphysical, the metaphysica, right? The beyond nature, or the principles of nature, or the next to nature. So this is where he's coming. I'm just trying to, give you a broad,
I get that.
the background. Okay, fine, good, okay. Yeah, so, then when you're going to ask questions like being of a world, right, for Heidegger, that would mean that there's a consciousness involved. And that's not really what he's interested in. He's interested more not in consciousness out there. Husserl thought, Sartre would really say, there is a consciousness for you and there's a consciousness for me. And there it is. Right? In some ways, right? So this exists, right? Right. So he's trying to stay away from the philosophy of consciousness here,
Right.
and build yeah.
I only brought that up because as
Yeah.
he was trying to define world,
Right.
he had missed that.
Okay, yeah, I
Right,
understand.
so-
Well, maybe when we
Right.
get to that section, we can let's return to the
'Cause I wondered why you
ofness.
omitted that.
Yeah, sure.
You're trying to
Fair
circumscribe it
enough.
and
Yeah.
try and get your hands on it.
Right.
Why would you also miss?
Yeah, I got you. Fair enough. Okay, good. All right. So anyway, so you can see what he does here. I mean, I basically, took this up here, right, in terms of the types of inquiries, the existential versus the categorical is going on page 54 in section, excuse me, in section 12. Right? Okay, let me just go on here. So we cannot understand, bottom of page 54, by this the objective presence of a corporeal thing, the corporeal, right? The corporeal thing, the human body, in a being objectively present. Nor does this term being designate a spatial in one another. So you can see the negations here going against, a body, right? And the spatial in one another, right? Okay? Interesting, right? I know they didn't speak about this in the Hannah Arendt thing. Any more than the world in, primordially, it means a spatial relation of this kind. In stems from, and again, the etymological here, the in non, to live, habitari, to dwell. On means I am used to or familiar with. I will take care of something. And you begin to see him beginning to develop what we'll see later as a really, very elaborate, structure of care, as foundation.
The dwell was what that eco-feminist book I was referring to.
Yes.
Discussing. It was about the concept of
Yeah.
dwelling as your responsibility for caring for the planet.
If you're interested in this thing of dwelling, one of the great essays he did is building, dwelling, thinking. We cannot think without that triad. We need the triad to think. Building, dwelling, thinking. And he distinguishes building, the verbs of the build, to dwell, and to think, right? And he shows the interrelationships between them, right? And he has a beautiful thing of the bridge. Actually, there's a picture of the bridge he uses in terms of the object. That you can get on YouTube. You can get the actual bridge. He's doing the analysis of what the bridge does, right? Yeah. So anyway, okay. So, but yes, the dwell is good, right? So we characterize this being to whom being in belongs in this meaning as the being which I myself always am. So the M that we go back to, we're no longer cogito ergo sum, which is what we're going to see from the Descartes, and I have it up there and there, right, etc. Or that but we're going to see ourselves as more dwelling, right, building and thinking, right. We reside, and you'll see this when we get to world. Yes, right. Yeah, sure, no
The
problem.
sentence that we're on right now, in stems from inon. Inon is a prefix.
Yes, it's a prefix.
And that's Latin, meaning to live.
Yes, to live.
And then when he says in the next sentence, on means I'm used to, is that the on from inon? Is he where's the on?
Anwesen means
on
you're
German.
familiar
German
to,
on.
German on.
Okay. It's like
Yeah, the German
on.
on. No, this is the German on.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm
okay.
sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. So, okay. So anyway, let's go. So I dwell, I stay near, right? The world is something familiar in such and such a way. Being as the infinitive of I am. So again, we get the verb working, right? That is understood as an existential means to dwell near, to be familiar with. So being in is thus the formal existential expression of the being of design. The being of design, which has the essential constitution of being in a world. Okay? This is important because it gives you, I think, the basis of why he's going to use Dasein throughout and what is in this mean, because he's going to be in a world, right? Yeah. Caring for, but care as a structure. We're going to see that later. So we're going to see a lot of this play out, right? And, if one is not dwelling, right, in terms of what is proper to one's dwelling, or one is not familiar anymore, etc., it means that
Are you here through 5?
yes, we are
Past 5 or just till 5?
past 5. Why, she booked it at 5 o'clock?
Yes. Let me just call her and try and figure out what
Yeah, well, I mean, we usually stay after 5, and we have been for a while, and I don't know why, yeah. And why, with all the room she has available on Thanksgiving weekend, why she would do this. She had nobody booked when I started anyway. That's being in the
Making more money.
place. Well, no, I'm aware of this, you know.
It's overbeing.
Yeah.
So Descartes' cogito ergo sum now becomes different, becomes much more complicated.
Well, you're
We
unlearning the
it's
thinking
not
and
just,
the
I
existence.
think therefore
right.
I'm self-conscious of myself. It's not just that. It's so much more than that.
Yes.
It has to do with the dwelling of that which belongs to dwelling as far as our design is concerned. I see. So it's a totally undoing the notion of Cartesian sort of logic.
Well, the Cartesian cogito,
The
and the
cogito,
cogito
yeah.
is being undone
Undone.
by, you're no longer just thinking
Right.
in a meditative place,
It's not enough.
right? In
Detached
the
from
thing.
your
Yes.
dwellings or
It has
detached
to
from
be,
care or detached from
you have to be connected to be in a world, right?
The
Yeah,
res
being it.
extensa.
The res extensa is the outside. The
This
res
is
extensa,
Connecting the
Yes.
being to the res
well, he's
extensa.
connecting the cogito, right? The thinking with the I am together. See, when he said, Descartes is doing that in terms of a therefore, in terms of a connected. Heidegger is saying, I am a thinking, being. I exist as a thinking being. Descartes says, I exist because I think only.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying. See, there's a big difference. And it takes in a world being that that this cogito is being analyzed. So you're basically undoing the institution of the West. I mean, you're undoing the machines. You're undoing artificial intelligence,
Because
the cogito,
software
the
thinks,
thinking self.
right? I mean,
Yes,
it's capable
exactly.
of that kind of
The
input,
I think,
input,
right.
some kind of a
Yes,
processing and
yes.
output.
Yeah.
And that's not sufficient, obviously. Much more than that. That's what Heidegger is
No.
saying.
Machines don't care.
And machines don't care.
Yeah.
And they can't care.
Not yet.
We don't know if you, we don't
You
know.
can program them to care.
Right.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But what does care mean in that sense?
Yeah.
Right?
Yes,
So
right.
it's a direct assault on
Yeah.
capitalism, essentially, and the fundamental notions of commodification.
Well, this is an assault on capitalism, the whole book. Whether it's a left assault is another story, but it's certainly an assault on capitalism. This is a romantic anti-capitalism at one level. Just as powerful as Lukács in terms of reification. We'll talk about that later, but we can talk about that. But yes, but the politics yield something different. I mean, in a way,
And
whether or
machines-
not we can, yeah, please.
Machines
Yeah.
don't have throne.
Yes, and they don't have projects without the programmer either. Right,
But isn't
right.
that part
Yeah.
of care and having a project is taking care, isn't it?
And they don't dwell.
That's one
They're
aspect of a
ephemeral.
project. Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
They
one
don't dwell
aspect.
anymore. The
Yeah.
machines, they're ephemeral. They
They're
don't
connected
virtual
to all over.
servers.
No, that's true.
No.
Well, they're everywhere, aren't they?
Yeah.
Well, I guess
No.
they do. They're everywhere. So the counter move to this would be like a vulgar sort of application of this insight would be sort of like, now that we live in a hyper-positivist world, let's say, where the machines are ever present in their generalized proletarianization, as Stigler would say, right? So now the working class, more people have joined the working class than in Heidegger's time. More people have lost their ability to do.
Well, it's not the joining of the working class.
Or
The
become.
working class. What's occurred, and Stigler is very much close to Heidegger on this, is that what's occurred again, this destiny of the Western metaphysical tradition leads to this ultimately, right? That this is where we've been, for lack of a better term, let's think of this as thrown. This is a kind of destiny. It's ascending of what we've been thrown into, right? In a sense, yeah. Yeah.
That's what I said.
Yeah. And this thrown into it, in a way, has made us incapable of making things anymore. We don't really know how to produce, make. We're no longer homo faber, right? We're just the consumer. We're just
homo
become,
datum.
we are homo datum, right? Exactly. Good, well put. Yes, absolutely. All we deal with is the data economy now versus a knowledge economy. There's no longer, and I think I've talked a little bit about this, that, you know, for some, we live in a post-knowledge economy, we live in the data economy. It's no longer whether you have truth or you have knowledge that you need. All you really need in terms of survival at this point is data, you know? And, you know, and
how
not
are you
even,
finding data is being just
right.
That's
Just-
open to definition because a lot of people are using data in different, which is not really, if you really look at it empirically, isn't really data.
But how are you finding data? Sort of like self-contained,
It may just
well-defined.
be maybe some study that fits, or maybe non-study, or that fits your ideology, really.
I'd say anything a machine can do.
Anything that
can
can
deal with,
shift.
Something that could be
We can produce data.
done without care.
Yeah, data,
Then we become
data comes from, again, datum, right, the givens.
The given.
But the givens, yeah, and the given, right, in a certain way. But what Stiegler claims is that no longer do we have a world of knowledge which puts to use the givens in such an organized, coherent, consistent fashion, because we no longer know how to make things with these givens. We can consume them. What the fuck is this? I mean, it's not even 5 o'clock, even if they have it at 5 o'clock. I gotta go through this goddamn interruption. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That makes us,
Yeah, it's a good idea, Sean. Thank you.
Others are thrown in too. So.
Yeah. Others are thrown in.
I think this is the big argument for today. This, I mean, for me, like this
Yeah.
sort of notion of data and
Thank you.
thrownness and care and yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, we're not really at care yet, but we're going to talk about that, of course. But right now, it's this right, in a world that's very, very crucial, right? Very, very crucial, you know,
Not-
to go forward.
not
And what
essential.
does the in mean, right? In a sense, this is what he's really trying to do.
It's
right?
kind of amazing
And
how he etymologically brought in to the being near dwellings near something that you care about. Like
Yes.
that's an incredible linguistic
Yes.
stretch, but
Yes.
he's going to try to prove it. But I mean, he's
Well, it's not a lingua. I mean, for him, his etymology is very
Evidence.
sound.
Yeah,
Yeah, his
I
evidence.
mean-
yeah.
Yeah, it's not like he's just making this up as
Right,
he goes
right,
along.
right.
I mean, it's very, very crucial. And you know, he had a very long argument, by the way, speaking of which, it's not that Heidegger went just, you know, unnoticed in all of this in terms of his use of words and etymology. They had a long, with one of the best German philosophers of his time, Paul Friedlander, about the meaning of the word aletheia, and Friedlander ultimately backed down. This is someone that was an expert philologist, etc. So there have been these encounters with Heidegger, just to let you know what you're dealing with. I mean, look, again, we're not taking the time because this is a lightweight, you know. But, you know, the philologists, you know, went after him, the linguists, etc., and always held his own.
Really?
Right, big time. And there's still a lot of, yeah.
I mean, it's beautiful the way that he framed it that way, and I assume that it's all grounded very much.
No, it's grounded, yeah. No, I think your assumption's correct because this
In
has
the
been done,
lectures,
yeah.
in his various lectures, he goes 50, 60 pages in one word, explanation, Greek.
Yeah.
I mean, it's overwhelming.
I mean, the Heideggerian exercise in everyday life would be to just think through one concept in a day. You know, and this would be your task. And only think that I mean, you know, this is kind of the ideal meditative activity in a multiple sense. Yeah. So this is important. Yeah. All right, let's go on because I have a feeling we'll be quote interrupted again by the being with others out there. Anyway, all right. Yes. Right. So this is interesting. Being together with the world in the sense of being absorbed in the world, which must be further interpreted as an existential, also grounded in being in. So you cannot be being with another, right? This mid-sign, being with others, unless you're grounded being in.
And he says
Okay?
being
And this
together
is
with-
important for relationships. If you really want to think about this, the best relationships are predicated on really being in a world. Yeah, this is what, you know, communication, you know, good relationships are really built. Maybe
Care.
Yeah. Well, of course, care. Yeah. No, of course. But think about this before you're with others, right? Being in something, right? First and foremost, right? It's-
But he's referring to being
Yes.
together with as the categorical understanding of present physically. Being together with was one of his two examples of in the page before, in being in space. Being together with was the first thing of the water is in the glass, therefore the water is with the glass in space.
Yes.
And so I think
He's
that's
going
what
to
he's
take
referring
that
to.
down later.
Right,
by the
but
way.
isn't that what he's referring to with being together with,
Yeah.
in quotes,
Yeah.
designed by, is,
Did we get this from you? I'm returning it from someone who took your
Yeah,
flyers.
yes, yeah.
Pardon me,
It's
to
right
interrupt
there.
you, but I didn't want to leave it in the bags. Please forgive.
Well, that's how he gets the world, right? Because if you're being with someone, where is that with? And
that's to count.
that actually determines, that necessitates a space, place. In this case, the world. Right. So that's one way of getting.
I
to
think
the
he's
world.
saying that when you're in the world, you're with the world in that sense.
Well, when he's doing being with creates, because you have two objects and they're together, but where are they together for you to be able to say they're together? They're in a space, right? Right. So to say they're together presupposes space.
Well, let's look at what he's got a very good
Yeah.
section
Yeah,
on
but
what you're talking
I
about.
know.
It has
That's
to,
what he said.
right,
Yeah.
it has to.
Yeah, yeah. If you go down the page, look, as an existential,
In the world, yeah.
being together with, this is the next full paragraph down after being together with the world. Being together with the world never means anything like the being objectively present together, right? Of things that occur. There's no such thing as the being next to each other of a being called Dasein, with another being called world. It is true that at times we're accustomed to express linguistically the being together of two objectively present things in such a manner. The table stands next to the door. The chair touches the wall. Strictly speaking, we can never talk about touching, not because in the last analysis we can always find a space between the chair and the wall by examining more closely, but because in principle the chair can never touch the wall, even if the space between them amounted to nothing. The presupposition for this would be that the wall could be encountered by the chair. A being can only touch a being present within the world if that first being fundamentally has the kind of being in. Only with its Dasein, something like world is already discovered, in terms of which beings can reveal themselves through touch and thus become accessible in their being present. Two beings which are present within the world and are moreover worldless in themselves can never touch each other. Right?
So
Interesting.
touching is an act of Dasein.
Yes.
Yeah.
And encountering
Absolutely.
is only an act of Dasein.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Neither can they be together with one another. Right?
Interesting.
If they're wordless, so if they're not, they don't
Yes.
have design.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
they're other than design.
Yes, if you
They're
have no world.
categories.
You have no world. And you know, the interesting thing about this, if you start thinking about this vis-a-vis, existential psychoanalysis and existential psychotherapy, when Lang was doing his stuff, he would always talk about worldless, ness of his patients, right? That they had lost world. And Binswager, the case of Ellen West, and other things like this are very interesting in terms of this notion, because they've lost touch, because they have no world.
Lost
Right?
touch.
Very interesting.
Lost touch with the world.
Yes, because they have no world. So touch is the presupposition of touching is really having world.
Right.
You must have world. Right? You cannot have world lost. Right? Right? So, yeah. So being in touch becomes a kind of therapeutic clarion, if you will, in a lot of ways for these people. And it's very rich. I mean, I think in the sense of, looking at people that are very mentally, not your average neurotic on the couch like up in this neighborhood, but, the other, yeah.
They've got some non-average neurotics.
Oh, they have some non-average?
Yeah, in
Okay,
this
all right,
neighborhood,
good,
too.
okay. It's still neurotic, it's not
Yeah,
worldless,
right.
right? I guess that's the point, yeah.
They've got a bit of
Okay,
growth.
all right. The supplement which are moreover worldless, must not be left out, because those beings which are not worldless, for example, Dasein itself, are present, they're present in the world too. More precisely, they can be understood within certain limits and with a certain justification as something merely present.
But
But, right? To do this, what? One must disregard, or just not see the existential constitution of being in. But with this possible understanding of Dasein as something objectively present, and only objectively present, we may not attribute to Dasein its own kind of objective presence. This objective presence does not become accessible by disregarding the specific structures of Dasein, but only in a previous understanding of them. Dasein understands its own innermost being in the sense of a certain factical, and again, the entities and being factual objective present. And yet the factuality of the fact of one's own Dasein is ontologically fundamentally different from the factual occurrence of a kind of stone. The factuality of the fact of Dasein as the way in which every Dasein actually is, we call it its facticity. And this again is a starting point when you're taking the mental dispositions, the case history, etc. It's facticity. It's not just family history or something like that. To the existential psychotherapist, if you will, again, you're taking the facticity into account. Not the factual objective presence. The complicated structure of the determination is itself comprehensible as a problem only in the light of the existential fundamental constitutions of Dasein, which we have already worked out. The concept of facticity implies that an inner-worldly being has being in the world in such a way that it can understand itself as bound up its destiny with the being of those beings which it encounters within its own world. Comradeship. Right there.
Or the lack of it if you choose.
And the
not to
lack
use
of
that
it if
word.
you choose. Right. Okay?
Facticity is the factuality of the fact of Dasein.
Yes. And factual objective presence lends itself to entities, right? And objective presence, right? Which again is what the scientists, when we go to
Right,
the
yeah, it sounds like
when you
he's-
begin to interrelate this to the terms he's going to use with world, right? Zoomhanden and Vorhanden, the difference between objectively present at hand versus that which is ready to hand, ready for use. And he's
whereas
going to
our-
play with this.
Our biology and our sort of scientific materialism discusses our beings as objectively present and nothing beyond that. I mean, only a theologian would discuss something beyond that in our current context, right? Like they talk about us and all of our thoughts and actions as physiological phenomena, even down to our feelings and sentiments. But this it sounds like he's trying to critique that. He's saying that if you want to look at
Well,
it
the
as a
human, I mean, if you look at it from the standpoint of biological determinism and that ideology, the whole DNA, the human genome project is exactly what it's up to.
Yeah.
It's about full objective presence,
Yeah.
right? Ultimately, where they've cracked the code, finally, and then they've cracked the code of existence, and they can say this is life.
It's interesting. Friend of mine,
Right?
good friend of mine,
Yeah.
was thoughtful, but he's a computer programmer, and he's thoughtful, but he got suckered into 23andMe, and we had this this genetic blood, that they take blood sample and they show on a Google map where your ancestors are from because they found matches in the pair, So he said, "Oh, I'm part Danish, part Icelandic, and like part Scottish." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, they found traces of me in like this region of Denmark." And I said, "Well, what does that mean? Like, do you think that this is genetically encoded, like the notion of being Danish?"
Getting away from meaning.
But he's totally convinced that's what's meaningful. Like that's what his identity. That's what his Dasein is. Like,
Yeah.
it's,
And they give you
Well,
percentages.
you've got
too.
Henry
The
Louis
percentage-
They give
Gates.
you
Yeah.
percentages.
You got the TV show with Henry Louis Gates.
That's just data.
Uncle Henry
Data
from
about
Harvard.
literally,
yeah.
10% Danish, 15%.
100%
That's
data.
probability. It's
That's
not even. It's
probability.
not even.
Yeah.
Well, he should know better.
Right.
He should know
Yeah.
how to
Well,
do
It's
it.
probability. It's
Yeah.
not even. I'm gonna tell him. that.
But that also
Right,
had
of course.
to do with wanting to believe.
Yeah.
right.
That's
Does it go back to
but
Neanderthal?
fantasy,
Yeah.
fantasy,
Yeah. He's like, maybe that's why I like cold weather.
Oh, God.
No, because you grew up in
Could be.
Syracuse, New York.
Fantasy.
That's why you like cold weather.
Right, because if you actually looked at what they
Well,
were
that's
doing,
why I grew up in
23andMe,
Syracuse.
you would know better. Right?
23andMe.
Because I saw that
Methodology
woman.
of the-
I saw that woman speak at South by Southwest a few years ago.
23andMe.
The most
She's terrifying.
creepiest
She's
woman
terrifying.
I've ever met.
The
It was
secret-
just like clapping and applauding her.
It's 23
I was
Oh,
like,
who?
she is stealing
23
genetic
now.
information.
Yeah,
She's
stealing
taking all of her
genetic
genetic
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
and
it's
she's
interesting.
putting together a database
Yeah,
for
she is,
herself.
yeah.
Because
Yeah.
she's going to sell it back at the end as soon as, at the end of the day. Yeah, exactly. It's for drugs.
So you can have
And you're not going to have access to
Danish
your information.
aftershave, Scottish cologne.
Right, you have to pay
Delirium.
for that in the future. You'll have to pay for that.
And
if
there's
you
no
need-
deleting it.
No, you have to pay for it if you needed medical
Gets worse.
intervention.
It gets worse. They also infringe on your privacy. My brother did it, and it kind of works like a Facebook, I guess. So once you put it in, then it links you to other people with similar.
relatives.
You're
So we
connected with,
found
so-and-so.
I didn't know we were
relative.
related.
Yeah. So wait,
I'm
that's,
calling
Supposed-
up Jennifer Lawrence. I'm on the vixen.
So after my brother did it, someone reached out to him over 23andMe, and it was this cousin that we didn't know about, that the father of this cousin also didn't know about, and reached out to my brothers to get in touch with him, which he did secretly. After my father called this guy and was like, Don, we have a situation. And supposedly, yeah, he has this illegitimate child. So they're completely breaking all privacy, you know.
It's a private company. They can do whatever they want.
Yeah, because you signed away
signed
your
it away,
rights.
yeah.
Really,
And then
of
he
course.
keeps trying to tell me to do it because we're mixed. He's like, maybe you have more black than I do because I'm darker skinned. I would never willingly give my information,
how
my
the
data
genome-
over.
It's not how the genome works. You know, they don't even.
And
understand.
apparently it gets better because of what you're saying. It gets
Right.
better because more people are doing it, so it makes her
Improves the
system work
probability.
better.
It's just a probability. It's
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's all it is.
it's crazy.
There's nothing to do about your history, but
No.
for some reason people automatically assume.
Hmm.
You know,
People
It's a
won't assume that.
disaster.
not even taking into account
Yeah.
mutations.
No.
You know, how those traits may have popped up in different places at
Right.
the same time.
Sure.
It's,
Yeah.
it's so
Interesting,
nuts.
yeah.
It's so nuts.
If you live near a nuclear plant, for example, then the data gets a little bit
Right. Yeah.
That would explain the cousin,
Right,
actually.
yeah. We'll check where they live.
It wasn't him, it was the nuclear power plant.
I
There
can
was
see
no
the new,
meaning
new
in there.
corporation, Purple Rain, right?
Purple rain.
All right, so let's go on. What Rachel was talking, I'm just going to skip around. So obviously, the next section is about spatiality. Being in cannot be clarified ontologically by an ontic characteristic. This is the middle of the first full paragraph on 56. By saying, for example, being in a world is a spiritual quality, and that spatiality of human being is an attribute of its bodyliness, which is always at the same time based on corporality. Here again, we're faced with the being objectively present together. He's going to go back to this objective presence again with the ready to hand and present to hand, distinctions. Of a spiritual thing thus constituted with a corporeal thing, and the being of the beings thus compounded is more obscure than others. The understanding of the being in the world as an essential structure of design first makes possible the insight into its existential spatiality. The insight will keep us from failing to see this structure or from previous canceling it out. A procedure motivated not ontologically but metaphysically, in which the naive opinion that human being is initially a spiritual thing which is then subsequently placed in a space. Okay, so he's going to take care of the theologians here, and
It's weird, aren't there
also the-
Christian Heideggerians? It's so weird.
There are
It's
some
like,
Christian
haven't they read this
They
part?
gloss over stuff. Jesus is always on the main line.
Oh, of course,
so,
of course.
That's gonna do
It
it.
sounds so much like non-dualism. The
Around what? I'm sorry.
It just sounds so much like non-dualism. The which is sort of a spiritual philosophical practice.
Well, he's actually critiquing the Cartesian dichotomy
Right.
of the res extensa and the res cogito, right? I mean, cogito, right? The thinking thing versus that of the extended thing,
Yeah.
and how that dualism is existent. Because what Descartes basically did was separate mind and body. For Heidegger and Adorno, that distinction, that dualism, not there. This is the beginning of the subject-object breakdown. This is already, subject-object dichotomy is a creation of a category. It's not being. It's not to be in a world, right? So yeah, it's going to go through. So anyway, with its facticity, the being in the world of Dasein has already dispersed itself in definite ways of being in, perhaps even split itself up. The multiplicities of these kind of being in can be indicated by the following examples: to have to do with something, to produce, to order and take care of something, to use something, to give something up, to let it get lost, to undertake, accomplish, find out, ask about, observe, speak about, determine. These ways of being in have the kind of being of taking care. So this is the first time he's going to mention care, and in this case it's not Zorga, it's Besorgen. And if you remember, I gave you the three different notions of care, right? The Zorga, the Besorgen, earlier in the.
You know who Dr. Zorgo is, right? The famous.
I do know Dr.
Dr. Kerr.
Right, Dr. Kerr.
He's a famous Soviet spy, German,
Yes.
anti-Nazi.
Yes.
Gave himself the name Dr. Zorgo. He predicted the day the start of the
Dr.
war.
Kerr. Yep. The deficient modes of omitting, neglecting, renouncing, resting are also ways of taking care of something. Right? This is what,
So being a nice person is not what he's talking. He's not making these judgments.
No, there are no judgments here. No.
It's-
If you read this through value judgments or
Right.
personal logical judgments, you're missing the whole,
which is exactly
whole
how
point.
everyday conversation.
Everyday conversation is happening. How dare them to
Judgments,
neglect
yeah.
or admit? Don't they care?
Yeah.
That's a contradiction to Heidegger. Yes,
It's like,
they're,
yeah, they do
they're
care,
taking
but not
care
in the way
of
that you
something.
like.
Yes, no, they're taking care of it. He says it here.
Taking
It's
care
both
of themselves.
sides. You're paying attention to. You're very astute in terms of paying attention to it. Undertake something. Relinquish something. On the other hand, you can also take care by admitting, by neglecting. All of these things. He's very good at that. I mean, understand
Took care of the Jews.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't tell Heidegger that. Yeah.
Well, we use it. Yeah, we use that word, taking care of.
Yeah, taking care of someone.
Just doing good
You
work.
take care of them? Yeah. You whacked them,
It's the soprano, right?
right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
The soprano.
Yeah, take care of it. Yeah. No, it's
Could you
that's
call it like
a
an
very
action?
day.
Is it just sort of an action then, or is it?
Well, it's an action on both sides, right? I mean, because you also
inaction,
have,
yeah.
you have negligence on one side. On the other side, you have taking care of something, which could be multiple directions,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So he shows that, this aspect of care does not necessarily mean you're a humanist,
Right.
right? Or that you're privileging the human being in any kind of endeavor,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
You can care about profit over people.
Yes, you can.
Sure.
Yeah. That kind of language for Heidegger wouldn't wash at all. But I hear what you're saying. I like the example. I'm not knocking that. But for Heidegger, to say something like that is a value judgment, and it's not, within the realm. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Because
Yeah,
I
yeah.
really like this passage because he used a lot of verbs,
Yes.
and I don't really know other philosophers, but is he very unique in terms of how much he pays
He's
attention to
he's
verbs?
unique in terms of, yes, process. It's a good point. Heidegger is a very active use of language. Yes, he's always in the active mode, right? Very active mode. Yeah. The notion of freedom is not so active because freedom itself means the letting be, but it's also verb. But you're letting things be as they are. In the Sartrean spontaneity is a different story, right? The Sartrean spontaneity of freedom is you're actively taking up your freedom. Yeah, it's much more subjective, where in Heidegger, freedom means really letting things be as they are, letting the world be as it is, right? Right? Yeah. So this is another quote. We'll get to this later, because a lot of people have taken his notion of authentic living as also including freedom. We'll have to look at that very carefully, when we get to authenticity, which again, let me just put this on the board. You'll see in terms of the movement, you'll see authenticity and inauthenticity later. And these are, responses, if you will, to dread, anxiety, right? These are responses. You can have an inauthentic response to anxiety, meaning you don't take it up. You don't even accept it. You bury it. These are many, many things. You flee from it, right? Whereas the other one, you may embrace it and say, I must work through this, et cetera, right? For Heidegger, we'll get to this too. This is also connected later. For Sartre, you had something called good faith, acting in good faith, which is where you always privilege your freedom to act in a situation. And you act as if you're acting on behalf of the universal. It's a very strange, it's a very Kantian, you act as if you're acting for everybody. When you make an act of freedom. So the resistance, in a sense, in France, is a universal act, right, of freedom, because you're acting on behalf of everyone, not just yourself, in order to stay close to your values or something like that. And then, of course, he uses bad faith, which is the aspect of self-deception. You deceive yourself. He uses the example of the waiter in the cafe. And the waiter in the cafe is only going through the motions, like a robot almost, an automaton, because he's not really, quote, that waiter in the cafe. Even that's what he does, right? He thinks he's something else. So when you look at a film, bye-bye, David, have a good time. When you look at a film like Serpico, I don't know if you've ever seen that, but Al Pacino, right? Remember when he's with his girlfriend? How come all your friends are actors and actresses, but they all work in restaurants, right? So this was an example of Sartrean bad faith. I'm not really a waiter or a waitress, right? I'm an actor and actress, or I'm, a musician, or this kind of thing. So Sartre was very much onto this in terms of being and doing, right? Whereas in Heidegger, it's more like being and having, and how one responds, in a situation of dread and anxiety, even though anxiety is crucial to both of them. There's always the anxiety in the choice. Even in the non-choice, there's an anxiety. When you choose not to choose, you're still choosing. Right? And this is what people really refuse to recognize, including our union president. She chooses not to vote on the contract one way or another. So it's clear that she, bad faith all the way down. The non-choice, which is the choice. Choice of bad faith. I'm sorry?
William James.
Yeah, William James. Yes, that's true. Yeah. Who actually, has a kind of interesting take on free will. You might not believe in it, but you can believe in it, and it might, happen, right? He used to say in walks. He would talk about it. Well, anyway, we'll go back to that too. All right, so the taking care, and you're right, the verbs are always there.
Efficient modes.
Types of modes, etc. Dasein is to be made visible as care down the page. So we have taking care and care in chapter 6 of this division, right? As an ontological structure concept. And the expression has nothing to do with distress. When people say take care, you're in distress. Melancholy, you're sad. The cares of life, which can be found ontically. These, like their opposites, carefreeness, gaiety, are ontically possible because Dasein, ontologically understood, is care. So the understanding, the base of the understanding, the Verstanden, if you will, the understanding here is really care, Sorge, right, in the ontological structure. Right? Because being in the world belongs essentially to Dasein, its being toward the world is essentially taking care. Taking care. Okay? According to what we have said, being in is not a property wants to get away from that, attributes, characteristics, right, which Dasein sometimes has and sometimes does not have, without which it could be just as well as it could be with it. It is not the case that human being is, and then on top of that, it has a relationship to being in the world. I think we were talking about this earlier, you know, being and world together, right, in a sense. It cannot be laid on, right, which takes upon itself. Dasein is never initially a being which is free from being in, but which at times is in the mood to take up a relation to the world. This taking up a relation to the world is possible, only because, as being in the world, Dasein is as it is. This constitution as being is not first derived from the fact that besides the being which has the character of Dasein, there are other beings which are objectively present and meet up with it. These other beings can only meet up with Dasein because they are able to show themselves of their own accord, again, within the world. Right? Okay, the saying used often today, human beings have their environment, Umwelt, does not say anything ontologically as long as this having is undetermined. In its very possibility, this having has its foundation in the existential constitution of being in. As a being, essentially existing in this way, Dasein can explicitly discover beings which it encounters in the environment, can know about them, can avail itself of it, and can have the world. The ontically trivial talk about having an environment is ontologically a problem. To solve it requires nothing less than defining the being of Dasein beforehand in an ontologically adequate way. If in biology use has been made of this constitution of being, especially since K.E. von Bauer, one must not conclude that its philosophical use implies biologism. For as a possible positive science, biology too can never find and determine this structure. It must presuppose it and continually make use of it. This structure itself, however, can be explicated philosophically as the a priori condition for the thematic objects of biology only if it is understood beforehand as a structure of Dasein. Only in terms of an orientation towards the ontological structure thus understood can life as a constitution of being be defined a priori in a privative way. Ontically as well as ontologically, being in the world has priority as again taking care, and the structure gets its fundamental interpretation in the analytic of Dasein. Okay? So this existential analytic is absolutely crucial, you know, and we begin to see that, you know, at its basis, and taking care also has to do with having something, right? It's being and having, not just being and doing. But this is a very active moment in the ontological structure of Dasein. And what is presupposed always, again, when you do biology, is this ontological constitution of Dasein. You cannot do biology, you cannot do the Human Genome Project, you cannot do all these things that we were talking about without having, first and foremost, this ontological, you know, constitution of Dasein as a basis. Going back to what he talks about with fundamental ontology and the disciplines, okay? And the disciplines. And if you look at this in terms of the what you guys were talking about, doing these, what do they call it, ancestry and all this nonsense. Yeah. Anyway, you know, you're basically trapped within categorical thinking, you know, and it's always just the factual of the, you know, whatever the DNA is yielding, right, etc. There's nothing beyond in terms of the ontological. You know, so therefore your identity becomes completely bound up, you know, without any kind of ontological constitution of care. This is what is really happening here. It's care as you've been conditioned to think about it, not real care in Heidegger's term. So, okay, let me go on. I know we're really behind here. If you look at page. I mean, you can read this. I think you got the sense, right? I mean, you know, we've got the direction pretty well of 13 and 14. Let's go on to idea of world. You know, this is page 63, section 14, the idea of the worldliness of the world, the Weltlichkeit der Welt, right, in general. So in general, 14, right, we begin to talk about yes, we begin to talk about, you know, the having value, the world phenomenologically means to show and conceptually, categorically determine the being of beings present in the world. This is on page 63, the first paragraph, right? Describe the world phenomenologically. So first, right? But are we asking ourselves ontologically about the world? The problematic characterized is undoubtedly ontologically, right? But if it succeeds to the purest explication and the purest explication of the being of nature in comparison with the fundamental statements made by the mathematical natural science about being, this ontology never gets to the phenomena of world. Last paragraph on page 63. I'm sorry, this is this is very crucial because again, he's taking on the natural and mathematical sciences here, right? From the ontological, you know, base. Nature is itself a being which is encountered within the world and is discoverable on various paths and stages. So if Engels was to rewrite the dialectics of nature with Heidegger in mind, he would write dialectics of world. There's a project there. Dialectics of world, not nature. Should we accordingly keep to the beings with which design initially and for the most part dwells, to valuable things? Do not these things really show the world in which we live? Perhaps they do, in fact, show something like world more penetratingly. But these things are, after all, also beings within the world, right? So, anyway, let's look at the multiplicity of the meanings of the world at the bottom, right? Or maybe in the middle of the page first. Worldliness is an ontological concept and designates the structure of a constitutive factor of being in the world. But we have to come to know being in the world as an existential determination of Dasein. Accordingly, worldliness is itself an existential. When we inquire ontologically about the world, we by no means abandon the thematic field of the analytic of design. World is ontologically not a determination of these beings, which design essentially is not, but rather a characteristic of design itself. This does not preclude the fact that the path of the investigation of the phenomena of world must be taken by way of interworldly beings and their being. The task of a phenomenological description of the world is so far from obvious that its adequate determination already requires essential ontological clarification. So in order to make even a phenomenological description of world and being in a world requires all this, you know, backing up to the ontological. So first of all, we're going to go through the multiplicity of the meanings of the word world, right? It's striking now, we discussed it. So you can see, right? Various meanings and their connection. One, world is used as an onto-concept and signifies the totality of beings which can be objectively present. And I should do this now. I should do the Vorhand and, you know, let me just do this really quickly for you. Let me just do the, because this is important, to be objectively present. We keep mentioning this. If you look at your, yeah, you got it. Great, thank you. Okay. So, you have and if you look at the map I gave you earlier on, you know, that I have written out here, you can see we're in the existentialia. I don't know if you guys have this written down, ready to do so. But you know, again, the triad of care, self, and world, you know, playing into this. We're here now, world, and we're going to go through world as constancy, Dasein, right? We've been talking about being in. Now we're going to go to Zuhanden, which is the ready to hand, right? The ready to hand. Usefulness. And this as the present to hand. And this is what he's going to be using as what science does, objectively present. Right? So you have these two moments, things in the world, right? Present at hand and ready to hand. Right?
When he's been
So,
using
yes, please, yeah, I'm listening.
When they've been using the term objectively present throughout the first few chapters, was it a translation of the word for Handen?
It's probably the use of the word anwesen objektivat,
Okay.
right, which is the German term for objectivating presence or present, you know, objectively present. However, right, he is now looking at world in terms of, instead of the Cartesian extended things, as groups ready to hand objects in its use value, where Stiegler, for those of you interested in, I'm certainly interested in Stiegler, the technics is coming out of this usefulness. Technics in time is out of this. Technics as time. André Leroy-Gourand. You can begin to read, you know, and I like doing this because I think it makes you read deeper, and it also gives you, you know, some ideas outside of what we're doing only internally to his text. Right? So you begin to see the gesture and speech, you know, the things themselves, right, in history, right? Stiegler's notion of the techniques that were part of an originary, not the originary forgetting, as in Heidegger, but an originating default. So Stiegler, in some ways, if you're going to think about Stiegler vis-a-vis Heidegger, where does Stiegler take his point of departure from Heidegger is with world, and Zuhanden and Vorhanden, right? It's very interesting that he begins to start with world, right? In a way. Technics. The originary default happened. The techniques shape us. As Chris has pointed out, you know, the tool shapes the hand, not vice versa.
And Heidegger had that quote, I forget where, about in a later essay about the typewriter.
Yes.
Which violently sort of prevents the hand from
Yes.
essentially
Just think what your
function.
computers are doing.
So Stiegler basically says something different a little bit. He says, actually the tool is, the extension of the hand, the externalization, right, is sort of what defines us.
Well, the techniques is here, and its use and its usefulness defines us. Yeah. Now Heidegger's going to look at both of these, right, in a sense, but this is derivative. This is derivative both of ethos of world, right? You have the ready to hand, right, and then the presence to hand. So you see in the Vorhanden, you see objects as things, right? This is the way you relate. The surgeon sees the scalpel as a thing to be used, right? First as a thing, right? Something that occurs the world, right? Etc., right? Whereas the use is something to be used in the world. Right? Now this is ready to hand to be used in the world. I have to find better than a dump out of these classes. Yeah, anyway. So anyway, this is a very important distinction in his going forward here in terms of world. This is how he's trying to resolve, if you will, the Cartesian, you know, scientific rationality and its approach, right? He's really
Because
trying
these are
to-
both based in care, right? They're secondary to care.
Well, this is an attitude. If you want to look at this, this is a scientific attitude. This becomes an attitude. Right? This comes up as what we could call the scientific attitude. It's almost a comportment, to use language from another phenomenological field, the way something is comported towards someone, or design is comported towards an object, right? Something like that. So, yeah. So the Vorhanden is objectively present, etc. If we only see the world as present at hand and what occurs in the world, we're completely off base. This actually leads to, if you will, the Lukácsian term and also a Kantian term, really, to reification, to a reified world of objects. So you can see this very early on, and this, for those of you who want to read deeper into this or have heard of this, I know Arto's heard of them, Lucien Goldmann's book on Lukács and Heidegger can take up this kind of thing of objective presence, right, and reification, and look at Lukács and Heidegger in this light. And again, the German language is very interesting in this sense, because here you have the object, right, world, as well as you have the Gegenstand, something that stands against, right, as well, So you go beyond objectivity, right, in some ways, yeah. So the main thing is use, right, not in terms of instrumental, reason, right, but in terms of actual usefulness to us in the ready to hand. He wants to look at this vis-a-vis world, whereas this becomes derived. This is much more derivative, the scientific world outlook, if you will, or what he calls the scientific attitude. This is all coming out with this confrontation with everything from, 17th century rationalism, the Copernican, turn all the way up to Newton, and maybe, and obviously we'll see later with, quantum physics and, certain kind of spatialization of time in Bergson. He'll see this later in his reading, right, in his commentary here. So again, what then is the world? First of all, world is environment, right? And I like this in the sense of, let me put this up here. I think this is something I'm extrapolating. I'm taking this a little bit out of the text. World as environment. But the interesting thing about environment in the Greek world is ethos. We need more ethology. The environment, this is the background for the world ethics, right, in some ways. So some people, myself included, you can imagine in some way that even though this book, they asked Heidegger, are you going to write an ethics? In a way, he is writing an ethics. He's writing an ethics of the ancient world for the present world. It is both prospective and retrospective in a way. It's very kind of interesting, of which democracy is not the way. Is not the way. I want to say that again. There's no democratic notion here in terms of how we understand either American democracy or really, for that matter, French democracy. Yeah? It's not really operative, right? So, in terms of the politics. We can go back to that.
The mediocrity of the average.
It does. Mob rule, one level of the democracy, also, not sure that it is able to have the encounter against this, right, in the name of this, because technology and technique has overwhelmed us in the objectively present world, right? This kind of world that's derived, again, from the ethos or world as environment. It's a derivative moment, right? It's not really looking at world, right? It's derivative, the present to hand, right? The present to hand. So this is a very important distinction he makes. I want to emphasize this: the Vorhanden and the Zuhanden, right? And the Handen is here in both cases, right? One present, one ready. So the scientific view, worldview of objectivity, again, is a derivative concept here. It's derived.
World.
Yes, derivative of world, and also, yes, it's not yes, right. And it's only an attitude.
Yeah.
It's an attitude, right?
It's very much of a perspective from Dasein.
Yes, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go through this, but we can certainly go deeper, next time into this. I know anyway. The use of world as equipment. We're gonna talk about use now, right? You have use of world as equipment primordial equipment, and then the objectification of the world, how that happens in science too. How science begins to then project objectification. And going back to your thing about of, right, this objectification is part of being of the world. Okay, we'll come back to it. I know maybe you don't buy it. Yeah, no,
That's
it's
not
okay.
what I meant, but yeah, no.
What's that? It's not
That's
what?
not what I meant.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just meant in terms of argument.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, just in terms of why leave that off the table.
Okay, I got you. Okay,
Yeah,
we'll
right.
go back to that then. I think
Because I didn't know what was
I'm
going to
gonna
be
think
there.
about that a little bit.
I didn't
yeah.
know it was going to be there, so might as well. I sort of became curious because I was
Right.
It's like, what if we did go down that road?
Right.
What would we find out?
Okay. Okay, good. All right. And then the other one, the scene of the world, and this is going to be important. I'm jumping a little bit here, so I'll come back to the text. The scene of the world is as a existential of the self, in which the modes of the present to hand or ready to hand are different, yet they're incomplete ways of seeing. Right? They can't really see the world, right? As the way it is. So he has many plays on the verbs to see later, if you remember this, right? So you have circumspection, the world as environment. You look around, right? The circumspect. The considerateness, the world of the other, the Dasein's looking back, right? That's the considerateness. And then the looking at yourself, the looking through, which is really how we should use transparency instead of the way we look at transparency today as disclosing, quote unquote, the others, nonsense or whatever, right? So anyway, let me put this on the board. So you have, so this is about things, right? Things in world. And then we have seen in worlds, okay? So you have this constitution by the hand, right? Maybe we could say touching, if we want to put this into the realm of the senses. To play on a great Japanese film. Anyway, truly great Japanese film. Right? The hand, right, and the touching, right, first of all, that is what, is present to hand, becomes only objectively present, right? And then the ready to hand is use, right? And we have these two versions of the way we relate to things in the world. And then we go on to the types of scene. So we'd have the sight. It's all right. I'm expecting it now. Worlds. The monads. Right over here? Oh,
Just
yes.
put it on the center hole.
It doesn't, does it hold?
No, like in
In the little
the
hole
one
there.
above.
Oh, this one here?
Still gonna rock.
Right in the center here, like this?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, okay.
Done.
All right, good. All right, so anyway, let me put these, the types, so then you go from, in types of scene, and this is the verb siegt, right? Right, that's the German. So you have one is basically circumspection. Considerateness. And then looking itself, right? So you're, basically looking through, transparent. Again, reflection, verbs of sight, right? The considerateness, the world of looking back, or let's take this into consideration in the very serious sense. Also the retrospective, the world of looking back, and the circumscription, the world of looking around. Yeah. So you could think of this like, early film too, right? You have the flashback, right? The panning shots, right? And then ultimately, the transparencies on celluloid itself, right? In some ways. But anyway, he's talking about world here. This is the important thing. And to go back to the subjectively present over here, right? The objectively present, this is the rationalist tradition. So again, in the spirit of the history and positive destruction of the history of philosophy, the tradition, the positive destruction of ontology, right? He is going back to the Cartesian moment through the empirical moment to try to say that these are all still, those projects are still trapped within thinking of objects as Vorhand and objectively present. Right. And they forget use and usefulness, right, in this notion. Mm-hmm. Right? And you can see how commodification could come. He doesn't mention this kind of language, but you could begin to sense, definitely how commodification and other things start this way. So, okay, so yeah, so this is important, these types of scenes. So we have the types of handling, if you will, and the world is environment, one aspect of world as environment and environmentality. And we can look at the Greek word again, ethos, which really literally means environment, right? Yeah. Ethos, from which we get the word ethical, literally in the first determination means environment. Yep. And a kind of almost being with too. So an ethology would be a study of the ethos, right? Instead of using vocabulary, maybe part of the future politics would use words such as ethos instead of civil society and state. You would begin to think in that kind of dimension if you want to really do otherwise thinking for the political sphere here. What is the politics to come? The communism to come. How would this look, right? How would you build upon, these kind of logical, these categories, to move forward. One possibility. Okay, so yeah, and then you have substance, right? And then, remember, this is a priori experience that's going on as well. A priori experience is the a priori is always at stake. Again, this is a priori. And what he's trying to do, again, is link the a priori and the a posteriori a la Kant, right? To bring that unity of apperception, but for Heidegger, the unity is phenomena, not apperception or the transcendental apperception as in Kant. Because Kant attempts to unify the a priori experiential, right, with the a posteriori factual knowledgeable. This is, always a tension. So you're really dealing here with the relationship, if you will, in an epistemological language between the knower and the known. Yeah. This is really what's at stake here. And he's really, fighting against the epistemological.
There's no known without
right.
knower.
And the knower itself, the inquirer, the knower is now being replaced by the inquirer, Dasein. So if you want to think of this like a theater, the cast of characters, Dasein replaces the knower, right? And we don't know the known, but the idea is to, again, pose the question radically in a different way. So, I mean, I hope that helps. So, anyway, let me go over a couple of more things in the text, and then we'll, we've gotten through about 60-something pages in a few weeks. Huh? This is very dense stuff. Yeah, I mean, I wish we just had time to read and reread every week. This is, yeah. So I had the surrounding world. This is section 15 that I talked about, right? The surrounding world, the Umwelt, right? So you can talk about the world, the looking around and the surrounding, the Umwelt, the circumspection. This is page 66. The closest world of everyday Dasein is the surrounding world. Our investigation will follow the path from this existential character of average being in the world to the idea of worldliness as such. We shall shape the world, we shall seek the worldliness of the surrounding world, environmentality, by way of an ontological interpretation of those beings initially encountered within the surroundings. The expression surrounding world contains a reference to spatiality in its component around, right? Looking around spatially, the Umwelt, right? The quality of around, which is constitutive for the surrounding world, does not, however, have a primarily spatial meaning. Rather, the spatial character, which uncontestably belongs to a surrounding world, can be clarified only the basis of the structure of worldliness. Here, the spatiality of Dasein mentioned in number 12 becomes phenomenally visible. But ontology has tried precisely to interpret as Descartes the being of the world as res extensa on the basis of spatiality, right? The Cartesian project, as you know, spatialization, spatiality, right? Cartesian space, as we all, we know, right? Okay? The most extreme tendency towards such an ontology of the world, an ontology which is oriented in the opposite direction, that is to the res cogniton, which is neither ontically nor ontologically identical with Dasein, is to be found in Descartes. The analysis of worldliness attempted here becomes clear if we show how it differs from such an ontological tendency. It has three stages. One, the analysis of environmentality and worldliness in general. B, an illustrative contrast between our analysis of worldliness and Descartes' ontology of world, and the aroundness of the surrounding world and the spatiality of Dasein. So he's going to go first, again, to worldliness in general. You know, it's pretty amazing once you begin to think it, because what you're really witnessing here and encountering in the text is a demolition of Cartesian space, right? The entire, and how this world or worldview philosophy, an objectively present philosophy, and the scientific rational project can be undone. This is part of the unlearning that's happening here. Yeah? So please keep that in mind when reading it, because he's very firm about he's very violent about it, but very good, in the good sense of violence. Right? Yeah, Sean, yeah.
Oh no, okay.
Okay, all right. I thought I was going to get another, very deep question that I have to think about for a week. Right. Okay, so the handiness is on page 71, the Zoomhanden. Handiness he uses for that, for the Zoomhanden, and he uses for the Vorhanden, earlier, who used the hammering, right? Handiness of the hammer, the example of the hammer, if you know, on page 69, which is very interesting, I thought. Yeah, our usefulness, right? And servability, the useful thing. And pragmata, by the way, pragmatism comes from the Greek word of the things, the pragmata. Pragmatism is from the Greek word, pragmata, right? So, okay. Let me see some other, maybe high points. Yeah, I think next week we should do reference and signs, section 17, because that's the beginning of the discourse, and I'll relate that to, and significance, relevance and significance. We'll go up, and then forward. Okay, so anyway, because this fits nicely, the reference and signs. He has a kind of opening section on semiotics, the beginning of a semiotic theory here too, right? So anyway, page 75 is a nice summation, if you wish. According to our foregoing interpretation, being in the world signifies the unthematic. This, Sean, would be section 36 in chapter 3, section 16. You got it?
Yeah.
Oh,
my,
good.
My book has page numbers.
It has 76 like this.
Oh, you're on 76 now?
Yeah.
I think it's 75.
According to our foregoing interpretation.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
75. The original was 76.
Okay, I have the numbers to the original then.
Oh, you do? You have,
Yeah.
Oh, so you have according. Okay, good. Okay.
Yeah, so I've been following along.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. So absorption in the references constitutive for the handiness of the totality of useful things. Taking care of things always occurs on the basis of a familiarity with the world. In this familiarity, design can lose itself in what it encounters within the world and be numbed by it. With what is design familiar? What can the worldly character of interworldly beings appear? How is the referential totality in which circumspection moves to be understood more precisely? When this totality is broken, the presence of being is thrust to the fore. In order to answer these questions, which aim at working out the phenomena and problem of worldliness, a concrete analysis of the structures in whose context our questions are being asked is required. So this is where he's going to go into reference, relation, signs, and symptoms. Okay, this is going to be the next section. I don't know if we can pick it up probably next week. But again, the relationship, page 81, just to give you, a little bit of some hints here, because I know it's very dense reading. The threefold relation between sign and reference. Possible concretion of the what for of serviceability indicating is based upon the structure of useful things in general upon the in order to reference, right? As the character too of useful things at hand, the indicating of signs belongs to a totality of useful things to a referential context. And then 3, signs are not just at hand along with other useful things, rather in their handiness, the surrounding world becomes explicitly accessible to circumspection. A sign is something ontically at hand which, as this definite useful thing, functions at the same time as something which indicates the ontological structure. This is interesting. The structure, again, of handiness, referential totality, and worldliness. The distinctive characteristics of these things at hand within the surrounding world, circumspectly taken care of, is rooted here. Thus, reference cannot itself be comprehended as sign if it is ontologically to be the foundation for signs. Reference is not the ontic specification of something at hand, since it, after all, constitutes handiness itself. In what sense is reference the ontological presupposition of what is at hand, and as the ontological foundation, to what extent is it at the same time constitutive of worldliness in general? So we're going to go through theories of reference and signs, right, through into the next week. So we can begin there, right? This is a very interesting section. The being handy, once again, this I want to again emphasize this Zunhanden, the ready to be used, the usefulness in the world versus the Vorhanden is a very important distinction that he has drawn. It's crucial to understanding what he's going to try to do with language as well, as we go forward, and also crucial for being in a world, right? So he's trying to look at some levels, the worldliness of the world, right? What is worldness, right, is one of the structures at stake. These ways of seeing the world, right, based on the circumspection, considerateness, and the looking at oneself, or the looking at, transparent, through transparent looking glass, right, so to speak, right? This is also going to be crucial, right? And then ultimately how this leads to some kind of language, to discourse, right? Through reference, referentiality, and sign and signification. And to go back, what he's studying here is the logical investigations, which your buddy Derrida studied very actively, especially book 6, chapter 6 of the logical investigations of Husserl, on the difference between the indicative and the expressive signs, right?
The arrow, the ontology of the arrow.
Yes, yeah, that's one way, yes, of course, yeah.
Well, he mentions the arrow.
Yes, he does, yeah, well, you know, so did Zeno.
Who?
Zeno, the philosopher. Right.
Yes, that.
Yeah, the work of life is in the book. Yeah. So anyway, so there are all these things. Any questions or thoughts? I mean, I have no problem, you know, continuing. I just don't want to, you know, make make it too long. I mean, if you go back again, look at the chart. What we're really trying to do here again, I mean, I don't have it, should have, I don't want to put this back up on the thing, but you see, we're in world, right? And we're in relation to care, right? And Dasein, right? Okay, so we have this triad. You got this earlier
I don't
on?
think so.
Okay, I'll make you a copy.
Okay,
for you.
It's on the website. It's
Yeah.
on the Heidegger seminar.
Okay, yeah, I
There's
use
the
the website, yeah, okay.
Okay, so anyway, you see world, right, has ready to hand and objectively present in hand. And this, in terms of his, you know, let's try to think this at levels. One level, he's destroying the history of philosophy, right? The positive destruction of the rational project, the Cartesian project in particular, of which the modern scientific project and calculated rationality is built upon. He's also going to go a little bit into substance of Locke and Hume, but he doesn't, you know, really go there too far, right? And he's not going to mention it so much, but he's got it in mind, right? And he's going to go through Kant here, ultimately, in terms of the thing in itself. Because when you begin to think of what is this thing in itself, this Ding an sich, right? What does this have to do with ready and present to handness, right? Is there this unknown nouemal realm, right? For Heidegger, no, right? No such thing as the unknown nouemal, and that Kant recoils, right? He cannot really take this a priori on, you know, in the imagination and rethink it, right? Anyway, okay, so then we have being with others. We haven't really, you know, extrapolated about this, but this is another aspect of world, right? You're being in the world with others, right? And at the same time, you have this existentialia, you know, versus, you know, these existentials of being playing out that are constituting Dasein, right? That are helping constitute Dasein through the type of inquiry, the inquiry itself, the terms, the status, you know, and the types of self-awareness, right? This is all going on at this point. So we're beginning to see care at work. We haven't gotten to the terms yet of attunement, Befindlichkeit, right? Thrownness and facticity, because once we have an attunement in the world, we begin to understand our thrownness, and at the same time we begin to project, right? We begin to develop a project, right? In a sense, right? So we're going to be talking about that, and we're going to be talking about an embraciveness of the facticity. Being in also through language as interpretation, to go back to the hermeneutical, right? This is another step in this. We're going to be looking at being in as you know, as an interpretive, you know, exercise, if you will, but really, you know, hermeneutics has become sort of a science of interpretation, if you want to, you know, say that, you know, at this point. Or an art of interpretation might even be better, right? At this point, or art and science, right? So we're going to look at that. We're also beginning to look at circumspection, the looking around, sight, and all of this leads in some ways in worldliness to curiosity, right, in the world, right? If you look at, you know, your chart, right? And then we begin to have the other aspect of speech. So we have care in terms of a threefold movement as attunement, being in a world, right? And then as speech. And then this becomes the attention to language that Heidegger is so famous for. We reside and we dwell in a home, right? But and in world, right? However, at the same time, Language is the house of being, right? So he's playing on home, residence, familiarity, alongside of house of being, right? So this is going to happen too. And then the final part of this, of course, is then again by going back to Dasein, the self, the who is making the inquiry, and then ultimately these categories, as I put up, of authentic and inauthentic, and good faith and bad faith. How does one respond to these existential categories? Anxiety is an existential. It is not a category, right? When you say I got anxiety, panic attacks, you're not speaking Heidegger. Everybody's got panic. At bottom, we're all mere anxiety, as someone once nicely said. Yeah, right? Right. Right. So anyway, so that's sort of where we're going, and think of this again. We have, if you can read this way, both vertically, horizontally, you have the vertical, the traits and the characteristics, the horizontality. We have not really yet talked about time. We have to talk about time because this is the horizon, right? Ultimately, the horizontal structure in which we'll interpret. But I think it's interesting that, if you're going to begin to look at history, history is looked at through temporality, but not as the datum of temporality, not as linear temporality, not as causal temporality, right? But it's looked at as ecstatic temporality, right? And then we'll have to talk about that. It's the ecstasies as a condition for historicality moving forward. What does this mean? And then we can go back to how he writes the history of being. He's not interested in writing the history of the Gettysburg Address, or, the Battle of 1812, or something like that. Right? Yeah, this is not Heidegger. Yeah. But I must say that someone did a great job in this book. Stanley mentioned it last week. The other half of the story, this book by Edward Baptist, it's really quite good. The slavery and the making of American capitalism. It's a very interesting kind of approach through a Foucaultian reading of archive, where he'll look at a document and really build an entire thesis on this. One reads the archive in such a way that one sees very differently, ways of doing things. Not only as evidence, but built in the narrative and a kind of theory around it. So. Okay, so I guess that's it. We want to talk, go back to world, and what was the other category? You had world and Dasein together?
Of world.
Of world,
Right.
And then you want to talk about of world.
Right, because if you're looking at it and you're trying to describe it, granted,
Right.
I don't believe you said something about it implying consciousness.
Well, for Heidegger it would.
Okay.
He doesn't use. I don't really think.
Because I couldn't. I was like, no,
Yeah.
that wouldn't. You would have to assume that to begin with.
Right.
If your inquiry is to see what's there, you don't have to say.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. No.
Given
Okay.
that-
Fair enough.
right.
Yeah. I hear you. Yeah. I mean, it's of grammatology and Derrida. Not especially. Yeah. It's a meditation. On what is the study of grammar, of the written in history and the trace. Yeah. So he uses that. He doesn't use in grammatology. Right. Right. And phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty. The thing is in the phenomenological tradition, beginning with Husserl, of is always used because consciousness is always of something. It's intentional. It's an intentional psychical act.
Okay.
And that's why I'm, speaking this way. It's always, I'm conscious of you sitting there, right? And I can reflect on you and my consciousness and why I constitute you as another subject in the world, and what are the conditions for an intersubjective relationship. But that's all based on my consciousness of you. Not that you're in a world, in a place, etc. Yeah. So that's the Husserlian approach. Right. So anyway, but good, yeah. And I'm going to look to see if he does any obs. I'm going to have to comb that. So.
Okay, just something.
No, it's okay. No, it's interesting.
No.
It's an interesting thing because again, the phenomenological tradition, Husserl himself, the master of, transcendental phenomenology, and the phenomenology, which is, again, a movement of doing philosophy in the world. It's not philosophy as static or as analytic or as dialectic. All of these things are working in it, but it is really a movement of which we're never finished. It's infinite. It's an infinite task. Is always about the of, right? We are conscious of something.
And is that being used the same as conscious from? Like, because you're using of in the sense of from, or of the world. Rather
Well,
than,
of and from are different.
Yeah, other from it, yeah.
Well, from implies extraction.
right.
Right.
Well, yeah.
Right.
Sort of.
No?
No, it,
But you could be from the world, meaning that you,
we're in it, now you're,
yeah, that you originate, of the world. That, like in the romantic language sense of and from being the same word. Day in Spanish or
Yeah,
in
yeah.
French.
Yeah.
The idea that you come. That's what you
No, I hear what you're saying. Both is point of arrival and point of departure.
Yeah.
But point of departure is even first. I mean, this is Marx's genius. It's always a point of departure. I mean, Heidegger's doing the same kind of methodological movements of a point of departure. He's really doing this with its whole design. This is a point of departure. It's not a point of arrival or a starting point. He's trying to, build towards method because it's a treatise, it's a philosophical treatise. But at the same time, this is a departure, point of departure. Yeah.
Relative, I was looking at an economics textbook like last time because I was trying to sell it. Anyway, and it's a total point of arrival that's timeless. I mean, that's the methodology. There's certain things that are, and that's sort of this kind of hyper-positivist method.
Right.
There's no point of departures. They've already arrived.
Right.
There's no need to
They're all
question anything. They have the truth. The object. But they have power. I mean, it makes me wonder. But they have power.
Well, I mean, yeah, but according to Heidegger, the will to power is the last stage of the destiny of Western metaphysics. It's nothing new to him. I mean, it's not surprise to the, or a jamming of his ears. I mean, they know this. This is what they're thinking. I mean, in a sense. I mean, yeah, not only objectification, but the drive for power and the drive for, I mean, he basically said, well, went on the agricultural combines, he tells Marcuse, it's rapacious. I mean, it's worse than rapacious and worse than the camps, he said, And in some ways, if you draw that out, in a sense, in terms of the ecological movements, right, and in a way, Heidegger's got a point. I'm not saying that it's good, nothing. It's not, that it's not, nobody's, saying the camps, or lesser, right, but he has a point in terms of what's really going on there, in terms of the mentality. That's the thing that's important. Not whether, you're killing, 10 million Germans or Turkish migrant workers, or Armenians coming, into, whatever, or Syrians now in Germany. But the question is what is it doing to the food, to the, to the earth itself? This is what he's really afraid of. This is what it's really about. Because earth and world are also playing. Maybe I should do this before you go real
I just
quickly.
have one question.
Sure.
So, while talking, bringing up Nietzsche, would then this ecstasis, way of doing history or looking at history, condition of history, would that be somehow genealogical in a way?
It could be genealogical, yeah. You
And
do
also if you're
genealogy of
talking now
concepts,
about this,
yeah, of course.
what you're saying
yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
Yeah. I mean, there's this interpretation, this hermeneutical that he's going to use all the time, which is hermeneutical etymological, and you can turn that etymological into material etymology.
Right.
Why is it that Usia's last definition, by the time you get out of 200 years after Aristotle, it becomes known as real estate instead of substance. How does this occur in terms of new interpretations of a word? What are changing there? What is that context, etc.? And as Arto was saying, there's no eternal, truths or verités here at the one level. And then, of course, yes, the genealogy of the concept of being, right? He's doing this. Yes, he is. Yeah. Although he's not going to break it up into three, like to the monumental,
Right.
the ancient, the antiquarian, and the critical,
Right.
which is Nietzsche's moments, right? Yeah, I mean, he's more systematic, if you will. The stakes for him are to retrieve this thing. I'm not so sure Nietzsche wants to go to almost uncharted waters. I think Heidegger does too, but I think Nietzsche is really just saying enough is enough, and now we really are, but beyond in a certain way. So he renders the death of God comic multiple times. He renders basically value systems, how we get to these, through the transvaluation of values, kind of renders them, meaningless at a certain point. And how are you going to create this new radical aristocracy? In Heidegger's case, he's not convinced democracy is the right way, but he never comes up with a political project. You have to read it in between, in a sense. And this also goes back to Plato with the seventh letter. One of Plato's students became the leader of Sicily, and it was awful what Plato saw, and finally figured out the tyrant. Yeah, and he figures out that it's philosophers shouldn't have their hands in the political. This is his lesson he's drawn. But ever since then, we've had Hegel, Napoleon, Lenin and Marx, Heidegger and, Adolf and 80. Yeah, right.
Bannon and Trump.
Bannon and Trump, yeah. Well, that's what we've gotten to. There's your pastiche. But let me just do this real quickly, and then I'll let you, just the dudes of the night. Anyway, so, just going back to this whole thing about Earth and world, there's the fourfold, and this is from basically, right? And you have basically mortals, and divinities here. And you have
It's like a supply and demand curve.
right, Earth, and there is an economics. And I have a theory about this in terms of Wall Street. We'll talk about that later. Earth and horizon, or sky, right, etc. So anyway, this is the fourfold. So you're always playing between one's mortality and the gods that have not shown themselves, and then the play of Earth to horizon. Most people don't see horizon anymore because it's blocked, right, by 20th century skyscrapers and etc. But he's really talking about the horizontal thinking. So the movement is always between this kind of moment. But this is crucial, right? Unless you have this world and Earth, right? Nothing else. And you remember his definition of the human being. Did you read that part? Where does human being come from? From humus, from Earth. This is what the word comes from, right? So, this whole thing with agriculture is not so far off with Heidegger. So you have this, and this is always going on. So think about this as folds, this is folds. And unless you confront this, which none of our quote-unquote leaders are even beginning to think about, much less, in Heidegger's case, it's the awakening of the new, right? Twilight of the idols in Nietzsche's sense, but the preparation for the new, right? This is propedeutic in this thing. And then this relationship is always going on. But we don't see this in terms of figure ground anymore. We don't really relate to the world this way because we've been framed in grids, in linearity, and all these kinds of things. So he's trying to break out of that mold all the time. And we can talk more about that, Earth, world, and mortality and divinity, right? This is very, very important, and this is from both the origin of the work of art and building, dwelling, thinking, where he begins to engage this. So ecologically, the eco-feminists, they love this stuff because Earth and world in German is feminine. Heidegger, in some ways, some people said this is the feminization of consciousness. They say, yeah, they say. This is not brutal Nazi stormtroopers and the SA only, etc. This is really about the feminization of the world, and in a way. It's a kind of letting go and a letting be. This is one of the reasons I think the the Eastern world, for lack of a better term, let's say, when he began to travel, on the other side of Spinoza, if you will, in terms of the pointing of the direction, they were very accepting, because they said, our philosophy is not object-based, in a way. The Chinese are not about objects. They have a very different kind of relation to objects than the West does. Very interesting. I'm trying to create, I'm thinking through this, I have a working title for a piece called Thrasymachus, the Chinese Thrasymachus in Piraeus, since the Chinese just bought all the Greek shipping interests in the port, and Thrasymachus was one of the main characters in Piraeus in the Republic at the banquet, the early banquet there. And he's about power and stuff like that. I wanted to kind of think this through. But Chinese do not think about properties of things in this way. They just think of objects in the world. It's really interesting. They don't really have this objectivity, in a sense. Might just be pure use. And if you look at the Maoist art, the Cultural Revolution art, it's interesting. The harvest. It's always this collective spirit, right? Making something, right? It's interesting. So just these are asides. Nothing to, yeah. But anyway, we'll go back to that. But we'll go back to this too. This is always working in terms of his faults, right? In a way, we're going to talk about being towards death, the limit, right? The authenticity, the encounter with dread and anxiety, right? World and earth, right? Playing out on another level, and then of course the horizon is temporality, right? What are we really missing here? Yeah. So, see, the problem with capitalism to me today is it really wants to conquer speed. That's what it's really about. The essence of the being of capitalism is speed, and we have no way of, and it's basically the speed of light. This is what these algorithmic trading systems and all this is about. This is why we have such a hard time, catching up, etc. Right? But we have to freeze it. We have to slow it down to the point of where we can really examine it, right? In a sense. And so this is another story. So okay. So I'm gonna lose that mail too. So any questions or thoughts or no? Nothing? Good. Okay.